Thursday, October 13th, and welcome to the special meeting of the Boulder City Council. I'm Rachel Friend. I'm filling in for Mayor Brockett tonight and next week. So buckle up and have a little fun with this. And we're going to start with a few announcements. And I believe we have slides. Great, thanks. So first is COVID-19 testing and vaccinations. For information on COVID-19, either getting tested or getting free vaccines, you can go to boco.org/COVID testing. And we are still doing drive-through at Stasio Drive in Boulder 7 days a week, 8 to 6. So please get tested if you need it. And then next slide. Junie, we all heard that yawn. This is gonna be a long night, lady. I feel your pain. Okay, the next slide is we are returning to council chambers. We welcomed community members back last week for the first time. So we will be in chambers on the first and third Thursdays for our business meetings. So for example, next week we will be in chambers. And with the public being back in chambers, we wanted to remind you that we are now offering the public to participate both virtually and in person as options. And either way, you need to sign up in advance, and there will be no in-person signups available during the meeting. So that's a little bit changed from prior to the COVID protocols. So you need to sign up in advance, even if you're in chambers. You will be asked to indicate on the open comment and public hearing sign-up forms if you will be speaking virtually or in person. And in-person speakers will go first and virtual speakers will go next. All speakers will be listed in the order in which they signed up. And you can change your location preference if you need to by emailing Alicia, our city clerk, at cityclerksoffice@bouldercolorado.gov anytime before the start of the meeting. I think that's it for announcements. So with that, Alicia, call to order and roll call.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. And good evening, everyone. We'll start this roll call with Councilmember Benjamin.
Present.
Councilmember Folkerts.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Friend.
Here.
Councilmember Joseph.
Present.
Spear.
Present.
Wallach.
Right here.
Weiner.
Here.
And Yates.
Virtually present.
And for the record, Mayor Brockett is absent. So Mayor Pro Tem, we have our quorum.
Thanks, Alicia. Next, I was going to ask for a motion to amend the agenda to add item 5A, but I would like to withdraw that request to avoid some kind of process drama. So can I just strike the request? No motion to move on? Might be a question to the city attorney's office or to—
Yes, Erin Poe, Deputy City Attorney. Yes, if you'd like to strike that, we could move on.
Okay, striking. So I think that takes us to consent agenda.
That is correct, ma'am. Tonight's consent agenda consists of one item, 2A, and that is the consideration of a motion to approve Resolution 1318, indicating the City of Boulder's support for 1A, 1B, 1C, and 3A measures appearing on the 2022 November City Ballot.
Thanks, Alicia. Bob, you have a question?
Yeah, I just not so much a question, just have maybe a comment or a statement or a suggestion. I know we took a straw poll on this a week or two ago, and I respect that straw poll, and I don't want to relitigate or revisit that. There's a couple of things that have happened since then. However, I just wanted to call to everyone's attention. The county commissioners, I think, met on Tuesday, if I remember correctly, and decided, with one exception, not to endorse city ballot measures. They did endorse our climate tax, which I was happy about, but they did not endorse other city ballot measures. And then I understand that the school board met, I think last night, and they decided not to endorse the library district. So there's kind of some cross jurisdictional endorsements that are happening, or in this case, not happening actually. As I said before we took our straw poll last week, I don't think that cross-jurisdictional endorsements are particularly helpful or good. I think we should kind of stay in our own lanes and put forward what we're going to put forward and support those things, and let the other governmental entities support their things. And so I just wanted to, in light of those things that happened this week, I just wanted to maybe revisit with my colleagues on council whether we still want to do this. If people still want to do it, that's fine. I think there's going to be some abstentions tonight I will certainly abstain from taking a position one way or the other on these county and school board measures. But in light of the developments over the last 2 days, I wanted to just kind of check in with people to see if they still want to do these things. I predict that endorsements, if they happen, are going to be somewhat less than unanimous and maybe less helpful than unanimous endorsements. And so I just want folks to reflect on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. Is it okay if I ask Chris if we have a staff presentation on this, and then we'll get to maybe a straw poll for interest in voting on this still? Will that work for you, for your request, Bob?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks so much.
All right. Chris, is there a presentation on this?
And Rachel, no, we do not have a presentation on this item.
All right. Thanks. So, and it's on consent agenda. So ordinarily there would not be discussion unless someone asked for it, would be my understanding. So maybe let's just go right then to Bob's kind of straw poll, show of hands. Or would anyone like to have more comment before we do that? Looks like Mark would.
Yeah. As a individual member of the city council, I do support these, but I'm troubled by taking official positions on it. I would prefer if we could express our views as individual members as opposed to as a body. So I think I'm probably going to abstain as well, although making note of the fact that I do support these on an individual basis.
Thanks. Nicole?
Yeah, I was just going to say, since we already had sort of discussed this, I wonder if just kind of going to the vote is the appropriate way to move forward here.
I appreciate that. I think what Bob's suggesting, there's maybe been a change in circumstance by actions taken by county and school board that elevates this to wanting another check-in. Is that about it, Bob? Let's summarize it.
Yeah, it's the will of council. If folks want to just go to a vote, that's fine. The chips will fall where they may. I just wanted folks to have a sense of how the ultimate vote might go. If there was a vote, if it doesn't matter to people, you know, how many affirmative votes or negative votes or abstentions there are, then that's perfectly fine. I didn't want anybody to be blindsided.
Yeah, that's fair. Tara?
I just wanted to agree with Mark. When I abstain, I don't want people to think it's not because I don't think that these are great ballot measures, but more because I don't feel like, I feel like people can ask me personally, but I'm not that excited about having a council majority about these things that are out of our purview.
Okay, Junie, and then I have a question for City Attorney's Office. Thanks, Tara.
Thank you. I just have a comment to make. I think we, as a body, we know. I think someone watching, they may not fully understand what
Junie, breaking up a little
so
bit. Can everybody else hear Junie okay?
Maybe elaborate.
Junie, you're kind of, maybe take the video off and see if we can hear you better.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think what happened on the school board is something that, you know, maybe not everyone who's watching here tonight is aware of. So maybe elaborating a little bit more would be helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Matt, and then a quick question to Aaron, and then maybe Bob, you can kind of give Junie some more information.
Well, I think this is leadership. This is where we as elected leaders lead. We should be advocating as a body, let the crumbs fall where they may in terms of who votes for what. But this is where we lead. This is where we show our leadership to the community about where we find these synergies and connection points between issues that are between us or the county or BVSD. We are one large, you know, symbiotic ecosystem. We have to be able to do that, and playing the abstain and not weighing in, I think is an abdication of our responsibility to actually weigh in. I mean, otherwise doing the one-off thing, to me, that just it's not why we're here. We're here to advocate for what's better for our community, and if there's things like at BVSD in the county that are better for our community, then we should be advocating as such and do so as a body.
Thanks, Matt. Aaron, I've heard several people mention abstention. Can you tell how that will work in this context of a consent agenda? What will that vote convert to?
under the charter, section 16, should any council member being present refuse to vote on any measure, said member's vote shall be recorded in the affirmative. So I believe that's the section that would apply.
Okay, so I just wanted to clarify I think for people who abstain, that's going to convert to a yes vote. So for what that's worth. And then are we still okay with, will you let me know, Aaron, if we're doing something out of bounds for consent by through discussion continuing?
Yes.
Okay.
It's unusual, but not prohibited.
Okay, great. Okay, so Junie had asked if someone can explain what happened at the school board. I cannot. I don't know if a staff member knows or if that's Bob's to answer.
Yeah, you know, I did not watch the school board proceedings. I was just reported that it was a 4-3 vote, and they decided not. So somebody made a motion to endorse the library district ballot measure, which I think is 6C, and on a 4-3 vote, the school district school board rather voted not to sustain it. But I don't have all the details about what each of the school board members said. You know, in response to Matt, you know, I get what you're saying, Matt, as far as leadership. But we are drawing some artificial lines. I guess we're drawing them at the county lines because there's a whole bunch of state ballot measures that we're not weighing in on. You know, there's a lot of races at the state level, governor and state legislatures and so on and so forth. So I just don't know where we draw the line. It seems to me that because we're Boulder City Council, we draw the line at the Boulder City limits, and we start going out to school board, and then we go out to the county, and then maybe we should do the state, or maybe we shouldn't do the state. And it seems to me it's a little bit arbitrary there. And so I'd rather focus on the issues that are city issues, and let the school board advocate for their issues, and the county advocate for their issues, and the state advocate for their issues. So that's just we're just drawing. We don't disagree. We're just drawing the line in a different place.
Thanks, Bob. I would just add that I've always been the opposite of Bob on this, that I've always advocated to weigh in, including state ballot measures, not individual races, but ballot measures. So I'm comfortable doing so because I think that often the community does look to elected leadership to sort of signal where they are and help to interpret the different ballot measures. So with that, if there's no, although Bob, I appreciate you are dead consistent on this at all times. With that, let's do I think, straw poll for who would like to take a vote on the consent agenda and as scheduled, vote on the county ballot measures. Show of hands. I've got Nicole, Lauren, me, Matt. Junie's got a hand up, I think, yes. So that's 5, that's a majority. And I will say that Mayor Brockett had emailed ahead of time his support as well. So it's kind of 5+. So with that, I think we would need a motion for the consent agenda.
I make a motion. Go ahead, Nicole. I'll give you a second.
Motion to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Thanks. Elisha, I think this is a roll call.
That is correct, ma'am. All right, we'll start this roll call tonight for the consent agenda with Councilmember Folkerts.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Friend.
Yes.
Councilmember Joseph.
Yes. Yes.
Spear.
Yes.
Wallach.
Trying to abstain.
Weiner.
Terry, you're on mute.
Abstain.
Yates.
Soft abstain. Okay, thanks.
I abstain.
Benjamin.
Yes.
The consent agenda, item 2A, is hereby approved.
Thanks, Elisha. Thanks, everyone, for giving me a rocky start to my first 2-week stint here as sub-mayor. Really appreciate that.
You did a great job, Rachel, and thank you for accommodating me. I appreciate it.
No problem, Bob. Okay, so with that, I believe we're on to our public hearings. So back over to Alicia.
Thank you, ma'am. Tonight's item number 3 on the agenda is our public hearings. Item 3A is the input on proposed 2023 policy statement on regional, state, and federal issues.
And I'm happy to introduce our Chief Policy Advisor, Carl Castillo, and Laurel Witt, Assistant City Attorney, and they are going to kick off this annual conversation that we have on our policy statement. So Carl, take it away.
Great, thank you, Chris. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and begin a PowerPoint. So give me one moment here. Okay, great. Are you all seeing the slide? Okay. Great. Well, good evening, Mayor Pro Tem Friend and City Council members. As Chris said, I'm Carl Castillo, Chief Policy Advisor for the City of Boulder, and I am joined this evening by Assistant City Attorney Laurel Witt. This evening, we're going to give you a presentation, and the goals of it will be to propose the revisions to the 2022 policy statement, and or the changes from 2022 to 2023. Specifically, there'll be principles, positions, and priorities that we're proposing, and I'll be talking about those here shortly. We'll be looking for direction to finalize a 2023 policy statement, and ultimately, we're preparing council to participate in regional, state, and federal advocacy in 2023. One example of an advocacy opportunity that the entire council will have is the legislative breakfast that's scheduled for December 13th. So in terms of the purpose of the policy statement, you all know, but I'll go over it anyway. It's to inform the city's actions on specific policy proposals as they go forward. It allows the city to have a quick response to shape policy before the governments where decisions are being made, and to be nimble in doing so. And then in terms of the governments that we will actually be advocating before, it's regional governments such as Dr. Cog, RTD, and the Rocky Flats Stewardship Council. It's the state, both the executive branch and the General Assembly, and it's the federal government, both executive, legislative, and judicial in terms of amicus briefs, which we are grouping amicus briefs more under the advocacy side rather than a purely legal matter. So I want to introduce the advocacy team. So it is Laurel and myself. It is also Adam Eichberg and Will Coyne from Headwater Strategies. They're not able to be here tonight. I think most of you have seen them and heard of their presentation before. It also includes our federal lobbyists, Brett Garson and Christian Chin. And ultimately, it's our council. So it's all of you. So this is kind of the core advocacy team that is going to be advocating for what is included in the policy statement. It also includes many departments. And I was almost tempted to put in the individual names of the people who are very actively involved, but I did include the departments who are most actively involved in advocacy. And this really is a substantial amount of work in terms of using their expertise to conduct analysis, drafting coalition work, testifying. So when you think of the policy statement and who's behind it, it's always helpful to think about this as being very much a team effort. My job is to coordinate it and try to be the center of the hub in terms of communications, but it's a lot of people and there's a lot of expertise. So that's just something I wanted to mention. Likewise, we are not just advocating on our own. We are members of many intergovernmental organizations, such as the ones that are listed here on your screen. And each one of them is a force on their own. In fact, they're more forceful because they are made up of a variety of local governments. And so as members and active members of these organizations, we often have the opportunity to help shape the agenda of these organizations. And most of them have their advocacy team and lobbyists. So it allows us to really leverage basically our positions and to use these coalitions, to work with these coalitions to really advance our agenda in as effective of a way as we can. So in terms of the recommended changes, there are, as I mentioned, there's principles, which is a new category. I'll describe that. There's 15 position changes that I'll be recommending. I won't cover them all. I'll just cover the highlights. And then there is the state policy priorities and the federal policy priorities, which are the perhaps most important ones that you should focus on in terms of what you all should expect to see accomplished by the end of the year. So let me start off with policy principles. And these are new to the policy statement. I would see these as overarching tenets or values that inform all the city's intergovernmental advocacy efforts. And our first one is equity and racial justice. This was previously worded as a policy position, but frankly, it applies to everything we do. So we thought it was important to move it to a principle, and we wanted to make it number one because we know that this is incredibly important for the city and for the city council. So the wording that you have here was proposed and was run by the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee and supported. We also, at the direction of the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, ran it by our community connectors. They were very happy with it, but they asked that we add this language. So with that language, I'll read what it would read now, which is acknowledge and seek to dismantle institutional and systemic racism and prioritize voices, experiences, interests, and needs of communities that have been historically excluded. I recognize that this is short, but that's kind of the way, as you'll see, these policy principles are being worded. The second one is a recognition that when we engage in advocacy, we are doing so with recognition that we are part of a team of local governments that we will work with for a long time, and we would like to support them when we can. This is something that's come up in the past where at times there's been a bill where the city had limited interest, but our council said it was very important that they be seen as being a regional player. So collaboration is something that I know that I always try to make paramount in the advocacy efforts is to make sure that we're playing the long game and maintaining the relationships and enhancing them as we need to. Local control is an important one. Again, this was the position, and this is one that many of you have asked about. Generally speaking, as a matter of default, we seek to protect local control and home rule authority. This is kind of a given that our city council would like to retain the ability to make decisions for the city of Boulder and not yield that authority. However, there have certainly been times when our council has said that they would like to yield the authority, and perhaps one of the best examples is in the area of climate change, where we of course recognize that climate change does not recognize local borders, and that it's essential that there be perhaps a floor, if not a ceiling, at the state and federal level. So that's what this position is about. What's important to note here is while we're indicating support for local control, it also indicates that if there's any other place in the policy statement or any other position that council has made known that is inconsistent with protecting local control, staff and the advocacy team will always yield to that. And so, in other words, we're not going to be dogmatic about protecting local control. We'll always recognize there are times that we need to yield. And finally, this should go without saying, but the city will support seeking resources for local programs. So when we apply for federal funding or state funding or help advocate for a bill that creates new sources of funding, the one caveat is that we have always said that we will not be advocating for new funding if it's merely just shifting funding away from K through 12, pre-K through 12, higher ed, things like that that are just as important to the city. So we don't want to engage in that game where we're undermining our very important regional partners. So those are the proposed policy principles. All of them are new, and what's in red, as I said, is a suggested change from what was in your memo. The first policy position change that I want to highlight has to do with urban forestry. We've spoken about this before. It's part of an existing position. The main change that you see is to indicate that we were successful in getting funding for the U.S. Forest Service. In fact, we have gotten $1.5 billion that have been included in the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically for urban forestry, which is a huge success. And we all know that urban forests are probably the most impactful things that cities can do to build resilience in the face of climate change and extreme temperatures. Trees can lower urban temperatures by 10 degrees. So what we propose to change this position is to indicate that now the goal is to secure this funding and to make sure that we do so in a way that is recognizing that we can just be one city among many in the U.S. that is seeking funding for urban forestry, or we can be a leader, which I can tell you Brett Karen from the Climate Initiatives Department very much is leading an effort here to make sure that we coordinate among our local government partners to do so, to find out what the best trees are to plant, so that we can do that in a coordinated and informed way, and to make sure there's applied research that informs that effort, and to make sure that there is an equity-centered workforce program where we can have people that essentially, in the economies of scale of having a program that is not just unique to the city, but one that perhaps is throughout the front range, that provides jobs and that recognizes that equity needs to be at the forefront of both who gets a job as well as where we plant these trees. So we know that people who do not have the advantage of going into an air-conditioned office or an air-conditioned home or have to be outside for extended periods of times, these are the folks that need to make sure that we have urban canopies in their neighborhoods where they reside, where they spend time. So that is, when I speak about equity-centered, part of the how we would hope to get there. This is one of our proposed priorities, so I thought it was important to pause here and explain that with a little bit of detail. The next policy position change is just to recognize that there have been numerous attempts to prevent local governments from prohibiting or otherwise trying to strengthen our communities, our ability of our community to shift away from the use of natural gas. We all know that natural gas is a potent greenhouse gas, and that ultimately we will need to make the shift. There's a lot of issues we will have to wrestle with there, but we think that they are ones that local governments should be able to wrestle with and not have any prohibition from the state government. So for this next one, I'd like to turn it over to Laurel Witt. And Laurel, if you've had a chance to unmute your microphone, if you could explain these changes.
Great. Thank you so much, Carl. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Just wanted to talk a little bit about policy position number 22, which is on page 36 of your packet. This particular policy statement was not very broad and didn't have a lot of helpful stuff for things like funding. So we thought this position statement could be expanded a little bit to include some things that you see here on the screen, including increased funding for supportive services and permanent housing options. These are things that the city has tried to do in the past, and so it seems like something that we should memorialize in this policy statement. Additionally, you'll see some proposals to address those who often use our services frequently, if those proposals provide broad and systematically beneficial changes. And that broad and systematic beneficial changes is something that we talked about a little bit in our committee meeting, just to talk about making sure that this covers all of those who need services. And I will hand it back to you, Carl, for the next one.
All right, thank you, Laurel. So moving on to the next one. Let's see if there we go. So I know council and the city are engaged in a exploration. It's more than an exploration. We're beginning a pilot program on guaranteed income. And I had an opportunity to speak with Elizabeth Crow, and she mentioned that one of the challenges with doing so is that by providing this guaranteed income to individuals, there are times when we could actually cause them to lose current benefits. And of course, we want to design this to supplement, not replace existing benefits. And the benefit that comes to mind is SNAP, or not otherwise previously known as food stamps. So the position that is being proposed here, above all else, is that we make sure by seeking waivers on the income ceiling eligibility for any basic needs assistance programs. And it's important to note that I believe Denver, and if not just Denver, I'm sure other cities as well, are pursuing this. So we're hoping to find a coalition of local governments that can work at the state level. I think this might be something that could be done administratively. If not, it will be legislatively. And if it needs federal action, we would seek that as well. But we think ultimately that there should be a way for the city to work with helping people with this guaranteed income without causing them to lose benefits. It also indicates a support for the federal expanded child tax credit, which existed in 2021. It was lifted as, I gotta apologize, my little windows are overlapping what I'm trying to read on the screen here. It was lifted, and before doing so, it had helped an estimated 4 million people out of poverty. So hugely beneficial and consistent with a local cash assistance program. So that's why we put it there. Laurel, I'll turn it back to you to speak about gun violence.
Great. So earlier this year, as you all know, Council adopted several measures related to the prevention of gun violence. And this particular policy statement position needed to be updated to reflect some of those changes. This position statement is divided into two subsections. The first one is things that we would support the state doing, and then things that we would oppose the state doing. So the changes we made were in the supporting category here. As you can see, one of the things that Council adopted in the list of ordinances related to open carry prohibition. So we went ahead and mirrored that in positions that we or the city may support related to gun violence prevention, which is open carry prohibitions. So you'll see that change reflected here.
Thanks, Laurel. So the next one here is clean air. Restoring clean air to Colorado, a huge priority for council, I would say for everybody in Colorado. And this was something that we had before, but we wanted to expand on it. And decided that this is long enough that I would take the time to create some animated arrows here to focus one by one. The first example of how we would like to pursue clean air in Colorado through policy change is to make sure that the state strengthens its regulations and permitting and enforcement of high polluters. CDPHE, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, did receive money to do just this in the session that earlier this year. So now it's a question of making sure that they implement and use that funding to actually engage in that kind of enforcement. So that's the first priority, or maybe I shouldn't say priority, but it's the first example of how we would like to get the clean air. Secondly, we'd like to eliminate air pollution from combustion appliances in buildings, which I did not know. I knew that it was an indoor air quality challenge, but apparently it is also a significant contributor to poor outdoor air quality. Here we're talking about ozone, and apparently the natural gas, not surprisingly, eventually leaks from your house, and it contributes to outdoor air quality and the terrible ozone that we're facing here in the Front Range. The next one is we'd like to strengthen the regulations over motor vehicle exhaust. So what I'm understanding is that there's a lot of vehicles that are poorly maintained. They might pass the emission test, but between the emission tests, whether it's 1 or 2 years or whatever period of time that they're given to not have to go there, they may be out of compliance, and that it can cause quite a bit of a problem for especially neighbors that live along major corridors, which again, that tends to be our marginalized communities, which is most vulnerable. One of the things that exists is a mobile pollution screening unit that has been used in places. We think that something like that could basically detect whether your vehicle is polluting, and maybe not actually send you a penalty, but at the very least send you a requirement to get your vehicle tested, is one way to make sure that kind of a year-round way of making sure that vehicles are meeting basic standards. And I want to pause on this one because there was a piece of legislation that was discussed at the Colorado Municipal League on Friday that was closely related to this, which had to do with vehicles that don't have mufflers, and increasing the penalties and increasing the ability to require them during inspections. And I was surprised to learn that mufflers are not required in the state of Colorado. So I think that this all falls under the general category of tampering with your emissions. And so the same things that may cause nuisance issues from noise will often lead to air pollution concerns. So we would like to support legislative changes or regulatory changes that lead to that address these concerns. And then finally, again, recognizing that a lot of people have to be outdoors, and when we're getting to these 100+ degree days, we need to make sure that there's some safe indoor sheltering and some health services. And sure, we can do some of this at the local level, but this ultimately is going to require quite the coordinated effort, and ultimately it's going to require the state and federal government to help us out so that we can make sure that people are not dying because they have no choice, or having to go into a home that is just as warm. The next category, again, I'm going to cover this with a little bit of detail only because this too is a priority, and I should have mentioned it. And I'll circle back at this at the end, but air quality is definitely a priority focus for us, or at least what we'd like to propose is a priority. Wildfire prevention is a proposed priority, and what we know is that control of burns is perhaps one of the most effective things that land managers can do. Of course, the city owns quite a bit of open space. I've been told, and I am understanding, that we have very limited days that we can actually engage in these controlled burns, either because it's too dry, it's too windy, it's a poor air quality day. A variety of hurdles are there that really prevent us from doing what could most prevent out-of-control wildfires from occurring. We have begun conversations with the CDPHE to see what regulatory barriers might be lifted. We've also begun to speak with our legislative delegation to explore the possibility of legislation like was introduced in Oregon that would recognize that, sure, poor air quality days have to be respected by not having, more poor air added because of controlled burns. But of course, if we don't have controlled burns, it's going to be 10, 100 times worse in terms of air quality. So given the new realities, we need to find a new way to balance these somewhat competing interests and to provide the flexibility that we need. We also need to make sure that the very complicated ownership structure that exists along ditches, where a lot of brush will tend to gather. We have private ditch owners, ditch owner interests. We have public and private properties that are adjoining. We have neighbors that sometimes come to think of these ditches and the trees that are there as providing shade, and they don't want change. Bottom line, it's very complex, and what we don't have is state resources and funding to help mitigate the fuel that's loading up there. I understand that during the Marshall Fire, that the ditches were a major conduit for the fire that was roaring to the east. So we'd like to engage the state in helping us find out how we can help coordinate with this complicated ownership structure and to make sure that these ditches are being mitigated. As I mentioned before, we want to mention when we engage in both wildfire mitigation, thinning of trees, or whether it's urban canopy, we want to make sure that we do so in a coordinated fashion and that we create and we take leadership as a city to work on a regional, if not a statewide effort to create a equity-centered workforce where people can be working on this. And the model that is being proposed out of climate initiatives is a climate conservation corps. So kind of a take on the conservation, civilian conservation corps from that was a post-depression era. And also one that there's Congressman Ghgs is very supportive of. But at this point, I understand that there's not really been any advancement of it in Colorado. We'd like to see if Boulder can be a champion of making sure that one is created. As Council Member Matt Benjamin had brought up to my attention a few months ago when there was a potential, I think it was called a fire hawk. And the question was, where should these firefighting resources be located? We'd like to make sure that we have a position right here that says the city would, yes, we'd like to have it in our backyard or as near as possible. First of all, we think that the Front Range is very much at ground zero for a lot of wildfire concerns. And we'd like to make sure that we have firefighting resources at our disposal as necessary. Also recognizing that overhead power lines and unsanctioned campfires are a problem in terms of an ignition source for wildfires. And again, we think that we will probably need the state and the region to help us combat these concerns. We'd like to make sure that we have resources to conduct fuel mitigation on residential lands, resources to address forest health, and strategic location of water resource infrastructure for firefighting purposes. I understand that there's been conversation by certain elected officials to make sure that the water is available to our firefighters when they arrive at the site. That's not always been the case, and there's been some limitations there. So all of these things we think are essential for the city to be advocating for, to be at the table. We are certainly affected by the lack of these resources. Lastly, so that concludes the changes that we're proposing to the policy positions. One change that we have not proposed yet, and we were going to bring up to the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, but we weren't able to convene them because of the change of the council meeting discussion on this prevented us from doing it. But Councilmember Spear had brought up that position 47, which has to do with healthcare, was somewhat limited in its use. You can see it right here. The key language is the city encourages lawmakers to determine which approach can provide the greatest access to affordable quality healthcare for the greatest number of people at the lowest cost. So it conveys very important values and goals that the city would like to reach. It doesn't identify whether we want a single payer or a multi-payer or what have you. And the reason we did identify that when we first put this in here a couple of years ago is because we knew that we had a lot of our own elected officials that had different views on it. And we also recognized that as since we were not a public health agency like the county, that we didn't have the expertise to recommend any changes. Nonetheless, council may very well want to revisit this. So I wanted to just bring this to your attention since Councilmember Spear did ask us to make room for this to be revisited. So now I want to talk about our state and federal policy priorities. And I want to mention again that these were developed in coordination with the Council's Intergovernmental Affairs Committee. And I'm going to start talking about different priorities. And they are a packaging of one or more of the policy positions that already exist. So we have like 60 plus positions. The policy priorities package one or two of them together to be something that we should focus on. It might even call to attention a certain aspect of one or more position. And they are ones that we think we can make a difference, that we want to use our political capital and our limited resources, recognizing that we can't go after everything in the policy statement. The reason these are being proposed is because there is political interest that would indicate that we can make progress on these. What I'm not going to be able to do is actually share details or sponsors because it's premature to do so. And frankly, it's not in the interest of the advocates to share information before they have their package ready, their bill ready. But I did want you to know that this isn't just a wish list. This is based on research that we've done and people we've spoken about, that these priorities are ones that we can actually move on. And we want to make sure that we influence them, if not lead on them. It's not just legislation. It could also be regulatory, and it could be just a question of securing resources. So it's not really even a policy matter. It could be just making sure that we're pursuing a grant or seeking funding through other means, through authorization. So for 2023, staff is proposing 4 state policy priorities and 3 federal policy priorities. First one here, I'd like to turn it over to Laurel. Actually, Laurel, I'm going to save you time here because really this is kind of reiterating what Laurel has already explained. So this is basically what she described before as our position on homelessness, making sure that this is identified as a priority. In fact, our number 1 priority. Number 2 is Vision 0. And this is one that we didn't talk about yet, but of course, protecting the safety of the users of our streets, of our sidewalks is paramount. And we've seen too many injuries and too many deaths over the years. And we want to make sure that we convey to our state legislators that a priority is to address this. And the way that we believe can be that something can be accomplished in 2023 is through expanding the use of photo radar, which is basically those cameras on the side of the road in a van where you have a sign in advance, and if you go over the speed limit, you get a ticket. There's actually significant limitations in where these cameras can be placed. Has to be in a residential zone, close to a school, next to a school, or close to a park or a construction area. There's quite a bit of areas, including our arterials, where most of the accidents occur, where these cannot be used. It requires vans to actually have a person inside them, which is somewhat defeating the purpose of the efficiency that this technology creates. Part of the goal is to make sure we free the ability of our police officers to engage in other work that may be equally, if not more important. It limits the amount of penalties that we can assess, and ultimately the deterrence value that we can impose. So for those reasons, we'd like to make it a priority to expand local control to use photo radar. We also, although not mentioned here, but I do think there may be some progress, or I should say, I do think the distracted driving bill that prevents adults from using cell phones that are not hands-free while driving. I think that may be reintroduced. And if so, we would like to again be part of the campaign to advocate for that. And that would fit under this priority as well. So this third priority is really a combination of what I've already spoken about in terms of mitigating climate risk of wildfire and extreme heat through forestry solutions. So whether it's planting trees or thinning trees, we want to make sure that we're securing the substantial funding that has been made available by the federal government under the Inflation Reduction Act, that we're doing it in a coordinated and informed way with the best science, and that we're using an equity-centered workforce program and a campaign that allows us to really do so in a way that benefits as many people as possible. And then lastly, in the state priorities, we are wanting to make clean air a priority once again. This was already discussed, so I don't need to discuss it again, but we think that these 4 state policy priorities reflect council's priorities. You can let us know otherwise. I will say that there is a limitation of how many priorities we can add, because it really comes down to resources. And again, these priorities were tied to doing some homework to make sure that they had the ability to pass this year. So moving on to federal priorities, the exact same thing that we want to do at the state level, we want to do at the federal level. So securing money from the U.S. Forest Service is going to require working with the U.S. Forest Service. Pursuing a climate conservation corps is going to require us to work with Congressman the Ghgs. He's been the champion of this idea. So it's both a state and federal priority, and it's been identified as such for that reason. Secondly, we'd like to, again, as we always do, make a priority to pursue congressionally directed spending requests, otherwise known as earmarks. We were successful in fiscal year 2022 in getting just under $250,000 for an expansion of the existing crisis intervention response team. For fiscal year 2023, we are in the running. It's not finalized and it won't be till the end of the year, but it looks like we are going to be likely to get $500,000 for the city's affordable housing modular factory and $20 million in an authorization under the Water Resources Development Act that will allow us to address a lot of water resource needs. So for fiscal year 2024, we haven't identified what we'd like to submit, but we'd like to get council's blessing that you are directing us to go pursue that funding, and we'll find what's going to be most viable. And we always try to pursue projects that are consistent with council's priorities. And lastly, under federal priorities is the Northwest Area Mobility Study Project. So as many of you know, this was a study that identified how, in addition to building the rail, which is going to take a long time, how we can make sure mobility is improved as we wait for the rail. It includes supporting the rail. And so as described here, it's basically making it a priority, especially when we work with the Northwest Mayors and Commissioners Coalition and Dr. Cog, where a lot of this funding comes from, that we're trying to secure funding for both the rail through the front range passenger rail system, which is being proposed, which has some possibility of making the Northwest Rail a possibility, and State Highway 119, which is a project, as you know, that we want to get some multimodal improvements. There's been substantial work and design and funding that's been secured, but we're still looking for some federal, direct federal support, which we have not gotten. So we want to make that the final of the 3 federal priorities. So I also want to mention that one of the things that we discussed in the memo is that we want to introduce equity considerations. Well, what I should say is we want to be enhancing how we formally introduce equity into consideration of our policy advocacy efforts. And the first approach to doing that, as I described, is to have a policy principle that describes equity, and we propose that to you. We want to make sure that when we propose changes to the policy statement, that we evaluate the changes to make sure that they're consistent with this principle. And in your packet, under each proposed change, we attempted to have some comments about how we thought that it was in compliance. And this is not to say that we're going to always say that every proposed policy position is in compliance with furthering racial equity. But if it's not, we want to bring that to your attention so that you can be intentional about deciding whether a policy is worth pursuing if it has any conflict or if it raises any inconsistencies with furthering racial equity. This is perhaps what I think is one of the most important parts, is that those of us who are engaged in advocating for policy changes at the regional, state, and federal level, we need to do a better job of reaching out to the groups that represent a lot of the people that are not being heard from the conventional mainstream policy advocates that are at the Capitol. And there are some groups that we have been working with, like 9 to 5 and CERC. We've worked with them on some mobile home legislation. CCLP, we've worked with them on some fiscal matters, Colorado Fiscal Institute. But there's many that we have not reached out to, like the NAACP and Green Latinos and ACLU and Center for People with Disabilities. We want to create a more consistent relationship where we're not going to them on any specific bill, but we're developing relationships where we're checking with them occasionally, basically a relationship where we're asking them, what's on your radar? What are the bills? What are the policies? What are the regulations that you have some interest in and what concerns that you have. This is not to suggest that they would then tell us something that we're going to automatically do it, but it raises an awareness that has all too often not existed in the policy advocacy work. So this would allow us to then, when we recommend something to you, or when we actually take a position and ask you to like let us know if you want to revisit it, that we're able to say, here's what we're hearing from a variety of organizations that might have different perspectives, and let you make a decision on whether or not it's worth the trade-off. Hopefully everything we're doing is in furtherance of racial equity, and I should say equity more generally speaking. But if not, these relationships would allow us to raise our IQ on these issues, or EQ perhaps. Finally, one of the benefits of our policy statement is that it allows us to move really quickly. When a bill gets introduced, when an amendment is being proposed, a representative can call me and ask me right away, and I could say, yes, council has given us direction. I know for sure they would support this, go for it. So we'd like being able to be quick, but at the same time, we always should have the time to conduct an equity analysis of the position that we're advocating. And so what we're committing to do is to do just that. It would be documented. It won't necessarily be shared, bill by bill with council, but it's something that we'll have there. So if anybody asks, did you ask the question? Did you even consider equity before you took a position on this policy matter? That we can say, yes, in fact, we're required to, and we have it documented, and we can dig it out. And we can share it with whoever we need to, or we can, frankly, it really should be at the top of our mind, tip of our tongues. So hopefully it's not just something that's lost in the file. I want to just conclude with this last slide about what to expect in 2023. And overall, I guess I'll start by saying forecasting is dangerous business. It's really difficult, especially given the high turnover. I heard that there may be as much as 60% turnover in the legislators at the Capitol. So we just don't know who's going to be there. We don't know whether the Democrats are going to retain the Senate or whether they're going to retain the significant majority they've had in the House. But what we have heard, and these are some rumors, and I'm not going to go into detail either because I don't have that detail or because it's not appropriate for me to share what I was given in confidence. This first one is one that I would like to ask Laurel to cover.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Carl. So this first one is something that we're hearing from the governor's office, just generally that the governor has expressed interest in land use matters to address affordable housing. He's not expressed interest in exactly what that will look like. We've heard some rumors, but we don't know the full extent of what that looks like. But if this does turn into a bill, I think that this is something that we want to discuss further when we see a bill, because there's a balancing act here between local control, which we've talked about, and wanting to have authority over our land use codes and the importance of affordable housing. So this could potentially go into things like our comprehensive plan or other matters that we deal with on a daily basis. So it's something that we're just not sure what this will look like. It's something that we want to bring forward at some point again. Again, affordable housing is a really important thing to the city, of course, but this is something that we're just not sure what it'll look like, but it's something that we're starting to hear about. And then rent control, that's the next one that Carl put up. Thanks, Carl. Rent control is something that's been discussed in the past. It's something that we're hearing again, that maybe there's a new discussion for rent control and what that will look like. Most recently, we've seen some incentives with rent control, being able to use rent control in a positive way, or in trying to help get more affordable housing. But the governor has expressed disinterest in rent control in the past for local governments to be able to do this. So I don't know how far this discussion will get, but it is something that we're starting to see a little bit, is this idea of rent control. Again, going back to affordable housing and some of those important topics that we talk about.
Thank you, Laurel. We're also hearing about a bill that would create a state building code board to create minimum standards for the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface. It would actually define what the wildland urban interface is. Of course, that has changed quite a bit over the last year. We are expecting legislation that addresses the very problematic concerns with underinsurance and the fact that people didn't know they were underinsured, and that a lot of insurance companies have gone out of their way to not make it easy by not providing transparency and using different databases on what it would cost to rebuild. And just bottom line, it's not to guarantee that somebody who secures insurance is fully covered, but that they have the ability to know, perhaps on an annual basis, what it takes to be fully insured, and they can make an informed decision. So that we can expect some legislation in that regard. So of course, Colorado allows abortions, but there's many other aspects of policy that may still need to be addressed, especially with cross-jurisdictional needs and travel and liability for doctors. So we're expecting some more policies to come forward in that regard. And we do, by the way, have a policy statement position that would allow us to support bills that would further abortion rights. The right to rest. I think all of you have heard of this, but in case you haven't, it's essentially a bill that in some variation would prevent cities. I actually should have let Laurel speak about this because this is under your topic, but I'll go ahead and finish just because I'm
That's okay.
It would prevent cities from banning camping. Some variations of it have basically said, unless the city provides a certain minimum standards for homeless services. So this is something that we recognize council would like to look into further. So if this was to come up, we'll bring it to your attention. We're not going to go advocating on it without bringing it to your attention and looking at the specifics. Generally speaking, we have a position to oppose taking away the right to ban camping. But if it gets more complex than that, and it creates some sort of balancing act about minimum standards that cities may need to meet, that would be a situation that we would certainly bring it back to the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, if not the full council. Expect something on geothermal electricity production. Creation of a clean hydrogen hub in Colorado, especially for hard to decarbonize sectors. A bill was introduced last year that would require EV charging requirements and pre-wiring for multifamily and commercial buildings. We expect that to come back, and we think that this time it may be brought back in a way that is likely to get the support from the governor. This was the bill that I believe passed and was ultimately vetoed. I think the thinking was that it was too, the cost that they would impose on both the homeowner, the owner of the building, and the construction industry was too high. So the question is how to do this in a way that wouldn't create that cost. So with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation, but I'm really excited to shift it now. Jacob and Anita, if you haven't already, you might want to turn on your cameras. I want to shift it over to two very good friends, Jacob Smith and Anita Seitz. Both of them, as it turns out, were mayors. Anita was a mayor in Westminster. Jacob was a mayor in Golden. They both have a quite impressive resume in policy advocacy. And right now they are leaders for the Colorado Communities for Climate Action, which is an organization that Jacob will tell you about. And I'll leave it with that, and I'll turn it over and start the PowerPoint. So Jacob, when you're ready.
Hi, everyone. I'm actually going to kick it off first, Carl. My name is Anita Seitz, and I am the Advocacy Director for CC4CA. I actually joined the team mid-legislative session, but I have had a long relationship with CC4CA. As Carl mentioned, I did serve on the Westminster City Council for 8 years, and during that time, I worked very closely with CC4CA. I was actually the very first president of the organization. During that time, I had the privilege of working and learning and collaborating closely with Boulder team members, and I just really feel I have a debt of gratitude. Carl Castillo and Jonathan Cohen both really helped me quite a bit as a new local elected. We're wonderful regional partners and helped propel my community's ability to meaningfully participate in climate action. And in addition to that, I am a Boulder High School grad, so go Panthers. I'm going to turn it over to Jacob Smith, our Executive Director, to introduce himself and our organization.
Great. Thank you, Anita, and good evening, Mayor Pro Tem and Council and staff, and really thrilled to be here. As Anita said, we work closely with your staff a lot, and it's a great relationship. We're very grateful to the support and the working relationships, and have also had the chance to work with some of you individually, the mayor and some of you on council, and really appreciate those opportunities as well. Carl, you can go to the next slide if you're still there.
I'm still there. Give me 1 second.
You bet. All right. Well, so we thought we would give you an overview of CC4CA. It's a good follow-up to the conversation you just had with Carl and his presentation. We are fundamentally an advocacy organization, and Boulder was one of the founding jurisdictions. Boulder and a small group of other jurisdictions about 2016 got together and had grappled with the realization that as an individual jurisdiction, it's very difficult to accomplish much at the state level. When you all are at the state legislature testifying, the only legislators that care what you think, hopefully, are your own state reps and state senators. Hopefully, at least they do. And the rest of the legislature, this is true for every jurisdiction, doesn't much care if you're outside of the jurisdiction. And the realization was on some issues where you really need a bigger voice than a single jurisdiction can bring, a coalition of jurisdictions speaking with one voice can be a really powerful tool, and it has turned out to be exactly that. I joined about 2 years later, 2018, I think. So I've been with the organization for 4 or 5 years now, and we've grown every year. The foundation that Boulder was part of creating I stepped into an organization that, certainly unlike some new executive director roles, there was no crisis to fix. There were no big problems to unwind. You and the other jurisdictions that had begun the organization had done a fantastic job of the foundation building. And so we've just been able to continue on that same trajectory since then. CC4CA is fundamentally an advocacy group. So our job is amplify the voices of local governments and local elected officials in these state and to some extent federal policymaking venues. And that is our almost exclusive focus. There are lots of other needs and opportunities and groups that provide some services and benefits to local governments, but our job really is this advocacy role. We do a little bit, and so that's really the important thing to emphasize here. And we work in all the same venues that Carl referred to, certainly at the legislature with the governor's office and his agencies, in the regulatory arenas like the PUC and the Air Quality Control Commission. We also do a little bit of work at the federal level that's really been around where we think we can have a real impact on outcomes. So the investment, or rather the Inflation Reduction Act, is a good example of where Senator Hickenlooper, hearing constantly from local elected officials and local governments about how important that was, as far as we can tell, part of why he was motivated to work as hard as he did to win over Senator Manchin's support and get something passed. So that's an example of where federally we'll engage, where we think we can actually make a difference on the outcome. We also do some other resource providing to local governments and capacity building work. We do trainings and workshops and briefings and provide lots of information to all of our members about what's happening on the policy arena, what's happening on the science side, and so on. And so those are things we do when we can to provide value to you all, to enable you all to be more effective as advocates on climate. But our core at heart, we are about the advocacy work. Carl, next slide. Thank you. This is a list of the members, 39 members across the state. Half of those are West Slope, 2/3 are rural. We represent about a quarter of the state's population. So this is a far cry from the half dozen jurisdictions that 6 years ago got together and started the thing. One of the most interesting shifts over time, the last couple of years especially, is the number of communities that are really purple or have historically been purple that have become members. And I think that's partly a reflection of just the politics in Colorado have started to shift some, or are continuing to shift some. And Carl, you probably saw that you switched off our display. I'm sure you can.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I was trying to move this. I was trying to move this bar, and somehow it is that working now, Jacob?
No, it's still I think we're seeing your screen on PowerPoint.
Okay.
It's all good. I'll keep talking.
Apologies for that. Yeah, you keep speaking. I'll get
Let
back.
us know, Carl, if we need to have the clerk's office take it over for you.
Thank you, Naria. I think I can
Yep.
handle it, but it'll give me a second.
So yeah, that's the important point I wanted to flag there is the membership has grown from the communities you would expect to be and have historically been leading edge on climate like Boulder and Boulder County, Pitkin County, to include a bunch of communities that's just not been the case historically. Well, even like Anita's case, Westminster, but also communities like North Glen and Avon, Edgewater joined recently. Wheat Ridge is I think the newest member, and those are all communities that historically have been much more purple. And so the fact that they are joining is a reflection of the political shift overall, but also just the growing awareness of the very real impacts that local communities are experiencing because of climate change. Next slide, Carl. The only thing I want to mention here is just to flag that the coalition, the organization, is governed by a board of directors like a ordinary nonprofit, and every jurisdiction has a seat on the board. So one of the organizing principles here is every member has an equal voice. It doesn't matter your size or your political heft, every jurisdiction is at the table equally. And that's a big part of, I think, why we've been able to grow the way we have. A lot of jurisdictions, the really small ones in particular, tend to be leery of coalitions like this where they are concerned their voice may get drowned out. And the fact that we treat everybody equally around the table is, I think, a big part of why we continue to grow the way we do. There are also lots of opportunities to engage for you all as members of the council and for your staff. And Anita will talk about that a little bit later, but the committees represented on the screen here, just some examples of those opportunities. Carl, the next slide, please. But the board is really the point I wanted to flag. I wanted to talk a little bit about the legislative session, and then I'll talk about some of the other regulatory and policy successes of the past year or so. This is just a high-level summary of the session from our perspective, focused on climate specifically, and you get a sense of just the scale of the work that we're doing. It varies by bill. As you can imagine, some bills have tons and tons of groups, and we're one of many that are at the table trying to figure out how to either get the thing done, get it over the line, or make sure that it's adjusted in ways that are going to work from our perspective as a climate advocacy organization, but the voice of local governments in the climate space. And then sometimes it's small bills that we run, or we are one of the lead groups running, where it's really a local government kind of issue and nobody else is going to pick it up and run it. But we think it's important enough to do that we do that. And a good example, a couple of years ago, we ran a bill to create, maybe last year, to create a grant fund for local governments to do natural hazard mitigation, like a lot of the work that Carl was talking about around fire and fuels, but to leave it wider. So it's not just about fire and fuels, but natural hazards that are amplified by climate. That was a gap in the network of programs out there. And that's a good example of where we stepped up and actually ran a bill to add some capacity and resources to local governments. Next slide, Carl. I wanted to highlight just a few of what for us were the biggest wins legislatively on climate. There's 6 here, 3 on this and 3 on the next slide. I won't talk about all of them, but I'll flag a couple of them. One at the bottom there is the air quality investments. Carl did make some reference to that. The $47 million listed there for Air Pollution Control Division, a lot of that is for enforcement. Enforcement has been underfunded for a very long time. We continue to improve the regulations on air quality, air pollution, and what the rules are and the thresholds, what's permissible, but the enforcement piece has lagged far behind. And the result is, even though the regs are better, we still have, in many cases, pollution levels that are far in excess of what the regs themselves ought to allow. So that funding is a big part of how we should make progress there. And that was one of the bigger wins last session. And then that very top bullet, the producer responsibility bill, I don't know how much you all followed that, but I want to mention it because it's transformative and immensely powerful. It essentially says, it creates a system where producers have to pay a fee based on the packaging, the environmental footprint of the packaging they use for their products. And so basically, products that are not recyclable or use lower content of recycled content, the materials themselves are a lower amount of recycled content, those packaging choices are going to result in higher fees for the producers. So it's basically created a market mechanism that builds those choices into builds those cost considerations into the choices from almost the very top of of the supply chain. And that's been so important because those costs, as you all certainly know, have been externalized to all of us and our local governments and our community members for forever. This is basically taking those costs and internalizing them into the cost of the product. So the idea is that will have a huge impact, should have a huge impact over time on those packaging choices. And then that money, we turn around and that money gets distributed out to local governments to pay for the recycling programs that local governments offer. If a local government actually provides the recycling service or pays for it, then that money will go to compensate or reimburse the local governments for those costs. And for local governments that don't, but their residents pay for it, that money will go to offset the cost of the residents. The vision is that every Coloradan should have recycling access that is as good or better than their current waste hauling service. And this is these kinds of programs they're very new in the U.S., but they have been well established in other parts of the world. And we have a lot of confidence that that is going to both transform how we think about waste in at least this one piece of the economy, and then also help use those dollars to actually pay for the recycling programs that our members, including you all, certainly value as much as they do. Next slide, Carl, please. These are just three other of what for us were some of the biggest highlights of the session. I won't go into them now, but I'm happy to talk about any of these later at the end if you have any questions or thoughts about any of them. The next slide, Carl. And then I'll talk a little bit about the regulatory and policy side. It's been I'd say comparable from the regulatory side compared to the legislative side, just a huge number of proceedings and some outcomes there that are transformative. A lot of these they will take time to materialize. So for example, last year, the bill that I wanted to mention is this is from the year before, set the PUC on the path to consider joining a regional transmission organization or creating one for Colorado. And if you're not a wonk about the energy grid, the simple version is just to say that is the way that we connect Colorado's grid to other nearby grids. We're basically disconnected now, which makes intermittent sources of energy work a whole lot better for providing grid reliability. If the sun isn't shining in Colorado, it is probably shining somewhere else across that much larger geographic area. And that because the RTO gets built out laterally across the US, it means we're covering multiple time zones. So peak use in the mountain time zone is an hour off from peak use in the next time zone over in either direction. And all of that means we're a whole lot better able to maintain grid reliability and stability, even being heavily dependent on intermittent sources like wind and solar. So this is a good example of this is going to fundamentally transform Colorado's grid. It's going to take some time, but the wheels are now in motion, and that's a legislative outcome. A lot of the regulatory proceedings now, that's the PUC is now doing the RTO work, the analysis to figure out what does that look like and what are the pros and cons. And so that's a good example of where the legislative work plays out in a regulatory fashion. For the past year or so, the ones I particularly want to call out, certainly making the coal plant retirements enforceable, federally enforceable now, is a huge deal. That was late last year as part of the ozone SIP, the State Implementation Plan, and the regional haze SIP. And that means these plants really are going to be retired and on this time frame, which is of enormous consequence. Again, you all, Boulder City Council, knows more about these things than most, and you certainly get the implications of that. And then Tri-State, which is not as relevant to Boulder directly, but is hugely relevant from a greenhouse gas footprint standpoint. I would say inconceivable even 2 or 3 years ago. Tri-State is now committed to 80% reduction by 2030, which is just, it's hard to imagine Tri-State, which has really been the laggard across the utility sector, stepping up the way they have. So these are some of the examples of, on the regulatory side, proceedings with huge implications for greenhouse gas emissions and for the work that you all do. I'm going to hand it over to Anita. The next slide, please, Carl. But I just want to emphasize that part of why CC4CA, part of why you, Boulder, and others brought us into existence, and part of why we have been as effective as we've been and are so important to our members as we are, our members mostly, if not all, have local goals and run into barriers at the state level. You want to accomplish a certain kind of pollution reduction, a greenhouse gas emission reduction, or an increase in transit services or something like that. And local governments often are running into barriers at the state level that just prohibit them from doing more than they want to do. Some of those issues that Carl was talking about are good examples of that. And that's a huge part of what we focus on. What are the barriers that are preventing or impeding your ability to get things done around your climate plan, your greenhouse gas plan. And we go after those and figure out how do we change them or remove them or at least tweak them in ways that make it easier for you to do the work you want to do. And that's married to so much, again, as you all certainly know, so much of climate change advocacy, the levers are higher than the local level. And things like how do we run the grid, things like ozone pollution, ozone, which is a huge health hazard, but also is a greenhouse gas. And also when the ozone precursors are emitted, we end up with other greenhouse gases that are also almost always emitted at the same time. So reducing ozone has huge health benefits, but also huge greenhouse gas benefits. And ozone is just that's not a challenge that local governments can take on at the local level. You can nip away at bits and pieces, and it's hugely important. But if the real levers are at the state level, and that's the work that we do. How do we make sure you accomplish your goals and locally, and make sure we're moving the levers in the right way at the state level for these larger scale goals? Anita, I will throw it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. So the slide you have in front of you shows some pretty impressive levels of participation from our member local elected officials and from staff. And I would say this is the real power of our coalition. We are an example of just the sum being greater than our parts. CC4C, our advocacy team, works really hard to make engagement easy for our members. So we will hold your hand through the process. We work directly with Carl. If any of you are ever interested in engaging on a specific topic, let Carl know. But once it gets handed over to us, we really do try to provide you as much detail and support to make it a pretty seamless process. And the reason that that's so important and the reason that we are so effective is your voices matter. As local government, we have a very deep bench of talent and knowledge and lived experience within our member communities. And we leverage this collective knowledge to impactfully engage with our state legislature and the agencies. So definitely let us know if you're interested in being part of these numbers in the future. We have really benefited from your involvement throughout the years that we've existed as an organization. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of different ways to engage. We don't just work, during the legislative session. As Jacob went through, we've been very busy with every single agency, and this has been a particularly busy year. So providing public comments or written comments in both of those venues is something that we can support you with. Also, though, some people like op-eds and letters to the editors, and we can help you get those placed and walk you through those processes. And then we've had multiple meetings with our both federal and our state delegation, walking through and really trying to make people understand the impact that climate change has on local governments. Our current president, Matt Scher, he says when they joined CC4CA, they saw climate change as an imminent threat, that it was something they knew was on the horizon and was going to change the livability of his county. He's an Eagle County commissioner. He says now the house is on fire. The impact of our work could not be more critical, and we have a great track record. But really, our power is our members, and leveraging them is how we get stuff done. Jacob?
Great, thank you, Anita. Next slide, Carl. We're at the very end, just a couple of thoughts about what's coming up. Carl did a great job of a rundown on the legislative session coming up, so I won't repeat any of that. I'll just mention that a lot of your priorities overlap with ours. That's not surprising because you all are at the table when we craft our priorities. So a lot of the work we'll be doing is going to tap into things that Carl talked about, like around air quality, certainly around wildfire and wildfire mitigation. Natural gas is another one. We're fighting a fight now at the PUC to eliminate a subsidy. There currently is a subsidy for developers who want to build new gas lines to new developments, and we're maybe on the cusp of eliminating that subsidy where every other ratepayer pays to build new gas lines, new development, which is crazy. So the legislative side, a lot of our work is going to line up to the work you do. We work closely, of course, with your staff, and our lobbyists all know each other and work well together. So I won't talk more about that. On the regulatory side and the programmatic side, there's certainly a ton of funding that is either flowing now through what people now call the bipartisan infrastructure law from the fall of last year, and now the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Tons of dollars are flowing or are close to flowing, and we're putting a lot of effort into making sure we can curate which programs are most likely to be beneficial to our members, and putting a lot of encouragement to the congressional delegation to help identify those programs, because it's a huge mass of programs and agencies and different requirements. So making sure as much of that money flows into Colorado as possible to fund good climate forward projects. That's one piece. I mentioned the producer responsibility bill. The next step in that process is the creation of a producer responsibility organization. And I should mention, I know EcoCycle is a big part of your community, and they were a huge part of the legislative effort to get that bill passed, and now the subsequent implementation side. So they are now standing up the organization that's going to govern that whole process. That's going to be a major priority for us, certainly over the next year. A lot of work on clean trucks. Some of that'll be regulatory. Some of that'll be the state's plans to fund and deploy technologies. There's I think Carl mentioned the hydrogen hub. That is another piece of this. Is hydrogen, what role does hydrogen play, or should it play in particularly with the heavy duty truck uses where electricity maybe batteries may be still more difficult to figure out. So there's a lot of work there figuring out what are the conditions where those, like on hydrogen, what should count as green hydrogen? How do we make sure that green hydrogen is really green? How do we make sure that it does actually work better than batteries before we see the state level policies drive forward too hard on that? But that is a lot of the work that's happening now. One of the biggest accomplishments over this past year was the adoption of this transportation GHGs rule, greenhouse gas emissions rule, by CDOT and the Transportation Commission. That was a huge effort, and the result is, for the first time in the country, this is becoming a model for lots of other states, and even the federal Department of Transportation is looking at what we did here in Colorado as a model where GHG considerations are now integrated into the Metropolitan Planning Organization planning process on transportation. So DRCOG now has to consider GHG emissions in a way it's never had to before. There's a lot of implementation work now that's going to continue to be a big priority for us over the next year. Lots of work at the Air Quality Control Commission, AQCC, and I'll mention just one more on this list, and that is the Excel, the resource plan. The first phase of that's now done. That was where we saw some huge wins around with Excel and retirement of coal plants and some of the other provisions about the decarbonization of the grid. But now is the next phase where all those things get translated into the actual bids and actual decisions about what resources Excel is going to spend ratepayer money on. So that is also going to take up a huge amount of time. We will certainly work closely with you and your staff. Jonathan is a considerable expert, as I'm sure you know, on Excel related and PUC related activities, and we do a lot there, so we work closely with him. Carl is great to work with on a whole suite of policy activities, so we'll continue to work closely with your staff, and happy to work with you all individually. We typically organize that through Carl, as Anita mentioned. Whenever you're interested on a particular issue, or if you let us know in advance, we'll keep an eye out for opportunities to plug you in. But just know Boulder is okay, so all of our members are our favorite members, but Boulder is our favorite member, and we really do love working with you, and happy to have a chance to update you tonight, and happy to answer any questions you might have. And Carl, yeah, you can jump to that last slide. Thanks so much, Carl, for the slides.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. And that concludes our presentation. And thank you for the patience, council, to hear this presentation. I know it was long. Frankly, previous councils knew a lot more about CC4CA and what they did. And as Anita said, they make advocacy easy for their members. And that couldn't be a better way of succinctly saying what they do. So we are part of many membership organizations, but this is our favorite. So I thought it was important to bring it to your attention. Last thing I will say, in terms of, again, the influence that we're having, currently Jonathan Cohn is the chair of the policy committee. So definitely we have opportunities to have our voices heard. So with that, I want to turn it back to council, and I know that it's time for questions, and I'd like to encourage council if there's questions for CC4CA, so that we don't have to keep them here, or if there's questions that are frankly ones that they're more likely to be able to answer, perhaps you could prioritize those. Again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Carl. And that is a great suggestion. Thank you also, Laurel, for the presentation, and Anita. And I'm looking for Jacob for being here and for that awesome presentation. So let's start first, as Carl suggested, with questions for our guests. And we're just on questions right now. We'll have a public hearing before we go to comments and feedback and vote. All right, Nicole, you're up.
Awesome. Thanks for that presentation, Jacob. Really appreciate that. And I apologize if my attention blipped during the presentation, but I just wanted to ask, is a kind of a housing density and land use something that is sort of in the realm of things being considered? Because so I'm our Dr. Cog representative, and there, of course, we've been talking and having a lot of discussions about that. So I was just curious how that is fitting in.
Yeah, thank you, Counselor. That is a great question. And Carl alluded to it a little bit. There's a real energy around some legislation that might try to weave together affordable housing, transportation, climate all into some kind of a package. The governor, as Carl mentioned, has expressed some, or Carl and I think Laurel mentioned also maybe, has expressed some real interest in doing something on this. We have some sense of what that looks like, but it's still pretty early. Lots of those interest groups, the stakeholders are at the table, including us wearing this local government hat, and try to figure out where we think we can get something done that doesn't cross the line that would not be tolerable to our members, that local control where that line is exactly, but does actually do some meaningful integration. That one thing I don't think I did mention, I don't think Carl did. One thing that's particularly unusual about CC4CA, and it's worth mentioning here on this issue in particular, is that to make changes to our policy statement requires every member to sign off on that. So to become a member, the elected body has to pass a resolution that says they support the policy statement. And that way, coming in, we know everybody's aligned. And once you're a member, you have essentially veto power over changes. And on paper, it sounds crazy. I have a 39-member board, and every member has to sign off on changes. In practice, it has worked really well, surprisingly well. And some of that's because we put just a ton of time into those conversations to figure out, like on this, where is the local control line that everybody can live with? And we'll work really hard to see something move through the legislative process that does something meaningful, bringing those pieces together, but stays on the right side of that local control line that is the hard line that our members are not going to be comfortable with, including certainly you all.
Thank you. Look forward to seeing what y'all come up with.
Thanks, Nicole. Junie?
Thank you. I just have a quick question. I was looking at some of the issues that you mentioned that are coming forward, and one that I was particularly interested in was the ratepayer regulation of Excel through the PUC. And I was wondering, is there a place where all this information is located, we can have access to them? Or is it a matter of, I suppose, reaching out to you after this meeting?
Yeah, that is a more complicated question than it should be, than it might sound. The PUC itself is terrible at making information available in comprehensible ways. The barrier to entry is pretty steep. You have to speak PUC, and you have to understand a website that's not designed to be used by people who are not deeply PUC literate. I think the PUC is taking seriously how do they make that better. So I don't want to sound like a criticism, but that has historically been the case, and it's still very true. So if you're trying to figure out what's going on at the PUC by going to the PUC website, the stuff is all there, but it can be very difficult to find and interpret. The pieces of the PUC's docket that we're involved in, we try to make that a whole lot more accessible. We do a roughly bi-weekly, we call it the Roundup, basically a newsletter to all of our members. It's pretty lengthy and detailed, So it tends to go to the board members and our committee members, not necessarily all of the elected officials that are on the bodies of every one of our members, but anybody who wants it, we are happy to add you to it. So one option is we add you to that, and every couple of weeks or so, you'll get a pretty detailed update on what's happening at the PUC that we're involved in. And I'd also say anytime you have questions, that feel free to reach out to us or ask Carl to reach out, whatever the right protocol is. We are more than happy to speak to you directly, provide any information you might want. We often prepare little background memos internally so that, like, if you were going to testify at the PUC, we can give you a backgrounder on that proceeding. So even if you're not going to testify, happy to share any of those that might be helpful to you.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Thanks, Jeannie. Any other questions for CC4CA?
Nicely done.
I struggle with it. I'm sorry.
Everyone does.
A lot of letters. Going once, twice. Thank you so much for, I mean, you're welcome to stay, but I think you'd be officially off the hook here. Is that right, Carl? Awesome. All right. Thanks, Anita and Jacob.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you. Let's move on to other questions just on the whole policy statement. Nicole's up.
Thank you. And apologies to the four of you who are on the legislative committee, because I've got some questions, but hopefully I can get through them quickly. One of the things that I was wondering about, Carl, and maybe other folks on the committee too, how are the principles prioritized? So, for example, if something can increase equity and racial justice statewide, are we willing to cede local control in that case? I mean, how are we kind of stacking them up against each other?
It's a great question. I mean, first of all, I'll acknowledge that this is brand new, so it's not like I necessarily have thought this through. But what comes to mind is that if any of these principles are being violated by advocating for a bill, that's something that we would want to bring to your attention. Essentially, that's a political issue right away. It might even mean that we don't even take a position until we check in with you. So that's probably the value of the principles. It's not a question of one being more important than the other. It's a question of all of them being important. And yes, there may be times that we need to yield local control or perhaps racial equity. Not everybody's going to be happy from that perspective. But like I said before, we're going to do it intentionally. We want to make sure this is basically a red flag for us. If our principle is being violated, we need to bring to you.
Awesome. Thank you. That's helpful. And I was wondering, did we consider climate resilience and social vulnerability as principles? Was that anything discussed?
I'm sorry, say that again?
I was just wondering if we had considered climate resilience and social vulnerability as principles, right? Things that would touch on multiple different ones.
That's, no, it's actually a position right now. And yeah, it's definitely a position. I guess the reason I don't immediately think of it as a priority, but you can convince me otherwise, or principle, is because does it apply to everything? I mean, if we're working on a sales tax matter, for example, is there applicability? I mean, I don't know. It certainly would be more than happy to add it as a principle if council thinks that's appropriate.
Yeah, no, it's just something that kind of came to mind for me, because that social vulnerability, I think, ties into a lot of different areas. And, and I do think about taxes, right, as relating to social vulnerability. Some of us are more vulnerable to increased taxes than others, for example. So for me, it just seemed just in line with a lot of the discussions that we've had this last year. And I think with the Storm and Floodwater Master Plan fresh on my mind, that idea was just out there as a principle. So then another question I had was around the rapid response racial equity tool. I was just wondering at what level we're focusing on assessments and impacts. Is that at the local level, or are we looking more broadly at regional, state, or federal levels when we're thinking about the impacts of policy decisions?
Again, a good question that honestly I haven't thought of, but what comes to mind is that it would, generally speaking, I think it would be a state. I mean, if it's a state policy, I think it's going to be a state impact, and that's how it should be reviewed. One way of looking at it is let's say we close a coal plant and it leads, well, maybe this is not a good example because not sure if that really fits into the equity column, but there may be an impact to one community or maybe even a series of communities that's negative, and we can benefit. And that may violate our equity principles. And I think that is included. I think that is a consideration that we'd want to take into account. So if I had to rank it, I guess I would say an equity issue that addresses our community is first and foremost important. One that is impacts outside the community is nonetheless one that's worth noting and bringing to people's attention and considering.
Okay, thank you. And then I was wondering if we had considered affordable housing as a priority. I know you talked about it a bit. It sounds like it's kind of going to be on the radar in general. It was just one that I was a little, I was expecting to see and didn't see it so much. I guess it kind of came from the rent control one, but.
Right, and I mean, again, what makes the priority list has up until now been checked a variety of boxes. It's not just what's important. Clearly, affordable housing is important, and that would be under everybody's top 3, top 4 list. And we have worked for the last 5 years successfully on mobile home legislation, which is one of the best ways to address the market rate affordability. And we also supported legislation last year that provided a great amount of Recovery Act funding for affordability. From what I know, in terms of what we can actually realistically get in 2023, it's a question of pursuing the grants. And that's something that Representative Mobley, for example, is really keen to make sure that Boulder is prepared, that we have some shovel-ready projects for the substantial money that is now being made available for mental health, for homelessness, and for affordable housing. So it's a little bit more, I mean, so the answer is we will be pursuing that, absolutely. And I tell that to Representative Mobley every time I speak with her, and I also thank her for reminding us. It's great to have a local champion, but I also, I guess pursuing grants, it's inconsistent with what I said before, but I guess I didn't think of that as translated into a state priority because I wasn't really expecting a policy change.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. And then I think this is a similar question to my first one about principles being prioritized. And so let me just say what I think your answer is going to be, and you can let me know if that's not right. So my question was about how policies are prioritized when they're in conflict. So for example, 22B about preventing camping bans seems a little bit in conflict with 32 about criminal justice reform to me, right? So I was just, in that case, then it sounds like if an issue came up, you would then bring it to the legislative committee and then to possibly to council for discussion. Is that?
It's almost like legal principles, but I think, and I am a former attorney, so I guess what I do, my process is to look at this, what's most specific. So there is actually language in the policy statement that says oppose limitations on cities' ability to ban camping. So that one would trump another one that could otherwise be read as allowing it. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, you can change that. You can strike that language right now. But yes, that is the way that that I interpret it. And I also, frankly, I mean, my job is to make sure I have a good sense of the pulse of council. It's not just the words in the policy statement. If I know that there's 1 or 2 members that are really concerned about it, I will probably check in with you individually. Because frankly, if we don't have a unanimous voice, and worse yet, if we have a council member going to a legislator and saying, don't listen to what Carl says, we don't really believe it, that's not going to really help. So seeking unanimity, and that's one of the benefits for working for Boulder, is that our council has so often been unanimous. So yeah, that's my
awesome. Okay, thank you.
Quick question, Nicole, if I can colloquy there, because the opposition, I guess, 22B opposed preventing local governments from banning camping in public spaces is one of the things I had highlighted as well. And I don't, I guess, given that you brought up in your short list, Carl, that right to rest is likely to be up this year at the state level, might it be more helpful for you to solicit feedback from us now rather than like if we know it's there and if that does need some amending, is this the time to look at that?
You know, so thanks to you, Mayor Pro Tem Friend, we actually have two pieces of language in that bill, in that position. One is protect our abilities, but also to look for the ability to kind of like raise the floor statewide. So to me, if it's just a straight out cities, you can't ban camping, I have the direction I need. If it goes into raise the standards and maybe some sort of trade-off, you know, allow camping unless you don't have enough homeless services. That to me is one that I would automatically take to you because that's such a tricky political trade-off. And it could very well be, after all, that we just decide we're not going to be involved in this. You know, we know CML is going to be actively opposing it. Or we could say, we do want to champion this. We want to stand out as a city that wants to support it. But in that other case, that's my political intuition that if it gets any more complex than the straight out ban, any conditional issues, that I'll bring it to you. And I will not be speaking on behalf of the city without getting your further direction. And the reason I'm not looking to resolve it now is because I just don't know how that balance might be sought to be struck and what shades they might propose.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that, and I can just come back to this in comments. Thanks for letting me colloquy, Nicole. But you know, that there could be a clause at the end that says something like, unless population proportional, adequate alternative housing options exist, or something like that. So I don't know when the right time is to look at that, but I don't know that that's exact. That 22B is precisely the majority of this council's probably preferred statement. Anyhow, back to Nicole.
Cool. Yeah, and that was for my comments later. But so anyway, thank you, Carl. Just wanted to thank you. And I apologize for springing these questions on you tonight versus sending them in advance as I normally would have. It's been a little bit of a week, but I really appreciate your fielding them at the last minute. And I also wanted to thank you for remembering my earlier comment about healthcare. I'm super impressed that you remembered that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Over to Mark Wallach, and if no one else has questions, I'll have a couple.
Well, I only have two questions. The first, Carl, and thank you for the presentation, regards policy position number 53, in which we advocate for the reduced threat of ignition sources such as overhead power lines. Would it be possible to put a little more meat on that? Because power lines are very dangerous. You know, we're talking about undergrounding with Excel, and it seems to me there's not very much there. And is it possible to do that?
Yeah, I mean, a good catch. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I think it should be qualified with something like such as unnecessary risks or risks that could be avoided with overhead power lines, because we're clearly not saying that we're well, it does start off with reduced threat. And in any case, I could certainly bring some more specificity.
Okay, I'm not asking you to do it now because I'm not trying to put you.
And I won't.
But it just struck me as you know, for a policy that's significant to this city and which we're going to work with Excel to do undergrounding, we ought to be advocates for you know, state and federal funding for that purpose so that we can accelerate the process. Because at the moment, I think we're looking at a very extended amount of time before we could actually underground all of our city.
I can certainly provide that specificity in the final. The council will have an opportunity to consider. Thank you.
My second question regards rent control. As I think it, and you can correct me on this, that it's sort of unlikely that the governor is going to be receptive to a rent control regime. Could we at least make a distinction between general rent control and manufactured home community pad rent stabilization, which is, we've discussed that a little bit. It's really a little bit of a different animal, and trying to get people to understand that it's a different animal. And for those people who will flexibly throw up their hands and say, we cannot have rent control, but I think we could make a good case that we ought to have pad rent stabilization for those communities because it's different. And, we've discussed that. We discussed it when I was testifying down in Denver on the bill. And I think there's a case to be made that might pass muster, even if the larger rent control bill does not move forward.
Yeah, and just to be clear, council's policy statement already states that we support rent control generally, and that we support the more limited version of it for pad rent stabilization. So the way I took that, for example, when we were working on mobile home legislation last year, is some advocates said, no, let's not include that for mobile home because that'll take away our ability to get a more broader bill, because that's one of the best examples. And yet I knew that there was no appetite for a full rent control limitation. So I pushed to make sure that we went for what was a very good example of where it's uniquely needed, unique vulnerabilities of the owners of mobile homes. And so that was included. And as you know, the governor threatened to veto it. That was to be, that continued to be included in the bill. So bottom line, even though I bring this to your attention because I know it's of great interest to our community, I think we know where the governor stands. And
another year, another opportunity.
Yeah, it doesn't mean we can't advocate, including before him.
Okay.
And it doesn't mean that we won't either.
Thank you.
Better way of saying we can.
And Mayor Pro Tem, that's all I got tonight.
Nicely done. Councilmember Wallach, double time. Okay, I think I have 4 questions, Carl, and I will try and move through them quickly. Still on paragraph 22 under C, D, and E. This is also new in the homelessness HHS space. D makes a ton of sense to me, increased funding for supportive services, but I'm wondering overall where this new, how did we arrive at this language? Because if I look at C and E together, I have some concerns that high systems utilizers may need more transitional housing as an example. So why did we say flexible funding for permanent? Maybe I don't understand the terminology here for targeted populations, but it seems a little bit more narrow and specific than I might want it to be.
Yeah.
Just wondering where we got that language, and are we sure that that's as a council what we want to be saying? Because I have some concerns that people are being given keys rather than the real supportive services, and maybe as I said last week, more group home options and transitional housing before getting into the permanent housing that is not helping people to succeed.
Yeah, I don't know if I have the bandwidth to completely help answer this question, but I'll tell you where the C came from, which is recognition. Many of you, of course, are aware of the concept of high utilizers, those who use a high amount of the city services and thus are having a great impact on themselves, the fiscal budget of the city, and on the community and public safety as a whole. We often attempt to find ways to address strategically those higher utilizers. And one possibility is that we might bring a policy recommendation to you on how to address that, recognizing that it might cost less for us to advocate for a state bill that spends X amount of money when it's going to be 2X if we don't do anything. The Intergovernmental Affairs Committee heard this recommendation, and they suggested let's hold off on saying that we would support those kinds of recommendations. What we can say, and this is what the committee said, and certainly you can revisit, is if recommendations are ones that would be broad enough to apply or potentially apply to other members of our unsheltered community, and have the ability to be replicated and systematic, that would be a win-win. So in other words, they would address the needs of high utilizers, help get them out of the unhoused situation, but also provide the potential to have a broader impact. And Councilmember Wallach, I hope I captured your sentiments in how I worded it there. And I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to that. Okay. So again, I don't know if this truly answers your question, Mayor Pro Tem, but that was the attempt. And so I recognize that these all may not be entirely consistent with each other, and I'm happy to make any changes that you feel are necessary.
Okay, and can we make changes, at the next committee meeting and then bring them back? Like, we're not set in stone here for the year if we tinker?
Of course. In fact, one thing you may do is say, this is good for now, but next time the committee reconvenes, just like Councilmember Spear asked, bring have the committee look at this to see if there's any need for reconciling potentially competing language. Would that work for you?
Yep, that's great.
Okay.
Okay, my next question is on the, I think I know the answer, but just checking, preventing gun violence. A lot of what we're asking for now, I think, has been sort of potentially bungled by the recent Supreme Court decision. And I don't know that anything gets done if federal elections aren't swung. So do we have any room to advocate to on who gets elected on things, or is that outside the scope of what we do? Because I don't think our advocacy on gun violence is going to make any bit of difference, because it needs to happen at the federal level. And if there are people who are appointing Supreme Court justices and whatnot that are ruling the ways that they're ruling, we're not going to gain the ground that we need. Is that illegal? I don't know. That may be for Aaron to answer. I'm not sure.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure what you're asking. Of course, I think we should advocate for whatever policies we want, and then let the Supreme Court decide whether it's unconstitutional. And until they decide that what we're asking for is not constitutional, we should reserve the option to advocate for it.
Yeah. Yes, and as a city, I think it's the advocacy is almost on who's appointing justices for a lot of these things. So
right.
Okay, I think I'm reading between the lines on your answer there. And then my last one is just on the Rocky Flat stuff. I just want, is the entirety of this section still relevant?
Yeah, great point, because we have carried it over for like 3 or 4 years. I think it was then Council Member Lisa Morzell who was very actively involved in Rocky Flats. And so I did look through it, and I believe it still is relevant. I mean, somewhat evergreen principles that are there, but if there's anything that you see there that you'd like me to research, to confirm, I did look at it, and I do think it carries over well.
Okay. All right. I'll look closer and ask you offline if I have any other questions. That's all my questions. So I think if no one else has questions, we will move over to the public hearing. I think we have one person signed up. Over to Alicia.
That would be over to Sarah to maneuver the public hearing and allow her access to speak.
Good evening, everybody. This is Sarah Huntley, Director of Communication and Engagement. Before we go into public participation for this hearing, as we typically do, I've been asked to go over our vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. And thank you, Emily, for bringing up the slide. So this is a vision that's been created with community members and city staff to support the physical and emotional safety of everybody participating in a meeting. So that includes community members, staff, and council, and also trying to make sure that we are making space for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. There's more information about the Productive Atmospheres vision on our website. Next slide, please. Specifically, what it means is that we have some guidelines and rules that we're asking people to uphold during this meeting. One is that all remarks and testimony be limited to the matters related to city business. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. Obscenity, racial epithets, and other speech and behavior that disrupts, or otherwise impedes the ability to conduct the meeting are prohibited. And lastly, we ask people to sign up to speak using the name they're commonly known by and to display that name before being allowed to speak. We are allowing audio testimony at this time. I believe you have one person signed up to speak this evening. You can take the slides down, Emily. And that is Lynn Siegel, and I can go ahead and allow her to unmute.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, Lynn. You've got 3 minutes, and I will give you a thumbs up that we can hear you when you start. But you are still muted at the moment. Sarah, can you remind us how would she unmute?
Yeah. Lynn, you should be able to unmute. I'll send you a note toggling you to unmute. Not seeing any unmute occurring. Lynn, all you need to do is unmute your microphone. I've turned on the ability for you to do so.
Is there also like a keypad sequence she could enter if she needed to? I'm going back to early Zoom days. It seemed like there was something.
If she's on the phone, she can press *6.
And if on a computer, is there a secret command something button? Anyone know?
I don't recall, but let me just look quickly.
Thanks.
Oh, she should be unmuted now, it looks like.
All right, Lynn, you're unmuted. Good evening. But we cannot hear you.
Yeah, you're unmuted, Lynn, but we can't hear you. That suggests your microphone is not working.
Given there's no one else in line for Lynn to queue up behind, I'll just give it another 30 seconds or so. Anyone else have command something options?
I'm looking to see.
No, she's unmuted, so that's not the issue.
And the one thing I could try, Rachel, I think the issue is the microphone's not speaking, but I could temporarily promote her to a panelist if you would like us to try to see if that helps get her access. And then I can bring her back down from a panelist to an attendee after the public hearing.
That sounds great.
Okay. I don't know if it'll make a difference because, as I said, it looks like her microphone is unmuted, but let's give it a try. Lynn, I've just sent you a note that invites you to rejoin as a panelist. Okay, there we go. Okay, Lynn, if you could unmute yourself, we'll see if we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm unmuting myself.
We can hear you.
We can hear you, Lynn.
And with my prompt, and I suggest that you get rid of Zoom webinar, web Zoominar. That's what it seems like at kind of Carnival. Webinar does not allow too many things, and it's being used throughout the city now, and it's really, really not good. And I appreciate you getting rid of Zoom webinar and just using Zoom. There's nothing scary about it. There's nothing security about it. It just needs to be used. It's a lot better of a format than Zoom webinar. I just had to go take some stuff outside, and so I didn't hear what you were just talking about, but I appreciate Carl's his presentation and what went before with the people about all of our federal opportunities and such. And I'm glad that y'all are doing such a great job on getting these opportunities open to the city. So thanks a lot. And that's all.
Thanks for being here, Lynn. And that wraps up our public hearing. So with that, we will go back to council members to see who's got thoughts to share and have discussion. Bye, Lynn. Anyone want to kick us off? Matt Benjamin, Nicole on deck.
Yeah, I get the full name treatment. Wow. All right. Well, so first, really, it's more just expression of gratitude towards Carl and the team. I have to say he has an uncanny ability to seemingly always be taking mental notes, because it seems like any passing little conversation or anything, he logs it away and then it ends up in the policy position. So just credit to Carl and the team for just always listening, really, to, even if we're not on the subject of policy, to take those little nuggets and fold them in. So just credit, because some of those pieces that were mentioned, I'm like, I don't even remember having those conversations as a group, but yet they folded in and they definitely, represent the will of this council. So just great work. And I like where this is at, and certainly respect where my colleagues are, and certainly some of those modifications and changes, and I'm glad they caught them. But by and large, this is a really nice policy statement. And again, credit to Carl and the whole team for doing that work and making it easy on us by always hearing all those conversations throughout the year to get it done. So thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Nicole Spear.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, thanks again, Carl. I had a few comments. I'm going to try to get through them quickly. Rachel, if it gets to a point where you're just like, no, Nicole, please go and have a conversation with Carl, please let me know at that point. Know that I'm open to that as well. I think, one of the points that I just had just around the state policy priorities is that the way that some of them are kind of phrased, I worry a little bit that they're impractical goals. And I wonder if we could just change the phrasing a little bit to make them more achievable. So as an example, we talk about ending homelessness, supporting the city's ability to end homelessness. And I wonder if instead we could shape that to be reducing the harmful effects of homelessness for all residents, or reducing chronic homelessness. Something like that feels a little bit more achievable to me. Kind of like with Vision Zero, we're not saying we're going to stop moving people through the city, just that we're going to work on doing that more safely, where nobody's getting killed or seriously injured. So I'm wondering about that. Similarly with the clean air in Colorado kind of priority, that I'm not sure that we're going to kind of restore clean air to Colorado, but promoting access to clean air across Colorado. Something like that feels like it fits in a little more with some of the new additions around making sure that people have safe spaces to be on bad air quality days and things like that. So just kind of, it's not changing them. It's really just describing them, I think, in a way that, at least to me, feels a little more actionable. And I wanted to say there was a point where we were talking about, sorry, let me find it really fast. The committing to regularly convening with organizations and communities that have awareness of potential inequities and policies. I really love that idea, and just want to, again, encourage us as we're talking to these groups that have this information, that we're making sure we're doing so with an eye toward acting on that information. If we're kind of frequently asking for this feedback and then overlooking it or ignoring it, I think that causes a lot of harm. So just want to kind of name that out loud. I think I mentioned this, got to it a little bit in my questions beforehand, but not seeing land use under greenhouse gas reductions at number 2 of the policy priorities, that was a little just surprising for me. I just wonder if it's something we want to think about adding in. And at some point, I'd be happy to give an update on what Dr. Cog has been kind of getting to around some of those things, if that would be helpful for all of us to move forward with that knowledge. I think Mark's comment about pad rent, or question about pad rent, is a really, really good one. And I would love to sort of see us even formalize that as something we're paying attention to, even if we don't feel like we can make a lot of progress with it. I do disagree with 22B. Just wanted to name that. It's not one I'm really comfortable having in this policy statement. And oh, yes. Okay. So another kind of bigger topic area. This was around policy number 24, where we're talking about immigration, and then also number 40 and some of the ones that followed there. We talk about protecting immigration data, but I think in this climate that we're in, where our rights, basic human rights, are being stripped away, specifically our reproductive rights, I think adding something there about protecting our health data and reproductive data from being shared also becomes really critical and important, especially depending on what happens in November at the federal level. And I think in a similar vein with number 40, adding language around our kind of access to gender appropriate healthcare and protections that we're putting in place for our queer and trans communities. That also feels like a really important component of what feels like a similar theme about what rights are we protecting and how are we ensuring human rights in an environment where at the federal level, they're starting to be stripped away a bit. And yes, I would love to have a conversation about adding single payer healthcare or finding some way of putting some teeth into the priority around healthcare. I think that would be wonderful. And let's see, I really appreciate the addition of air quality and clean air under the air quality and clean air, thinking about safe sheltering as well. So just thank you to everybody on the committee and Carl for including that. And for number 60, I would really love to get some feedback from the people at the Center for People with Disabilities at some point, just around transportation and modalities. And almost there, got 2 more comments. On number 61, where we're talking about transportation modalities, thinking about a future that has fewer cars and how is that impacting our transportation priorities and what kind of policies we're advocating for at the regional, state, and federal level. Because in the future, if we're doing things right, we will have fewer cars. So how can we start thinking about that now so the policies we have in 10 or 20 years are really reflecting the future that we'll hopefully have at this point or at that point, if we're doing things right now. And finally, around 67, and thinking about where we're advocating for higher education and CU in particular, I would love to see some things there advocating for housing and mental health services as well, because those are things that I think are campus-wide issues that also have impact on our Boulder community. So thank you. I'm happy to send those to you in an email, Carl, if you couldn't write as fast as I was speaking. So thanks, everyone. Those are all my comments.
Thanks, Nicole. I will ask if anybody wants to queue up behind me or just, make a few comments. So first, back to the 22 B, C, and E, I would love for us to look at some different language there and coming back to council with some amendments. So I'm not suggesting that we completely strike B, but I think that we should look at different language for that. And then C and E, I'm just not sure that we get to where I would want to go for ensuring that we are advocating for what would be the most effective uses of state law change in particular that might really help us to help people who are currently unhoused. So if we could do that, Carl, at subcommittee and come back with that I think that would be great. And then just again, with my not well articulated concern around the gun violence prevention, which is far reaching, just to consider whether we are empowered at all to do anything that might help get people elected who can actually make the things that we are advocating for happen. So we just, nothing's going to happen if people aren't in office who are going to enact any of these things. So it feels like an exercise in futility sometimes. So if there's a way to do that more formally through this arm of the city, I would like to know about it and you just use it, I guess. That's all I got. Any other feedback? All right, Junie and Lauren on deck.
Thank you. I just have a thought and a comment about the Make My Day law. which says that the city will oppose any policy change, but it says beyond personal residences. So I wasn't sure if that only means businesses. So I think maybe that needs some clarification of what do you mean by that. Thank you. And actually, I thought it's well written, and I did notice the comment made by my council member Spear about the homelessness. I mean, most of you know that I care deeply about the homeless, but I think ending homelessness itself is very hard. So I think reducing, or some of the language that was mentioning earlier, seems to be something that get us to something concrete, because it's so easy to have just lofty ideas about change. But if we limited it to things that we're doing concretely, that might be more helpful. So I thought ending homelessness, yes, that's what we want ultimately, but how we reducing it, I think those are some of the steps we can take. Thank you.
Thanks, Junie. Lauren, bring us home.
I don't know if I'll do that, but I will give my best shot. So I agree with some of the issues that were brought up around 22B, C, and E. I'm a little bit skeptical if we will be able to come up with a language change for B that would get unanimous support on council. I'm open to the effort, but that seems challenging. In terms of rent control, I really appreciated Mark's comments about wanting to have a specific call out for mobile home pads, but I also wanted to express at least my support that we maintain also the policy in support of getting rid of the prohibition on rent control. You know, that doesn't mean that us as a community would have to implement it. It would just give us the opportunity to look at that, and other communities around the state to do it if they desired. And again, I understand that the governor is not very supportive, but I think it's an important policy statement. Regarding homelessness, I appreciate a lot of the comments other council members have brought up. I understand why there's a emphasis on high system utilizers, but I also would like to see, emphasizing anything involving family homelessness. I think that that's something that we're not bringing to light enough and can often be hidden. So just trying to bring that forward. And I agree with Rachel's comment about for the funding for permanent housing options. I mean, it might be as simple as just striking permanent from that. I think that, I personally would really like to see us look at supporting all housing options. And that might mean looking at options that are not permanent as well. And protecting our health data, reproductive data, and access to gender appropriate healthcare all seem like really great additions as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Junie, your hand's up. Is that a new hand, or? I'm guilty of that all the time too. Okay, so with that, I think that the public hearing, I probably should have formally brought to a close a bit ago if I didn't do that. So that was brought to a close. It is now. And so this being a public hearing, I assume we need a roll call vote. Is that true? And a motion, or no? We're just feedback.
I don't believe.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I don't believe this was brought forward for a vote, only for input that Carl will take back and continue working on.
Great. Awesome. So in that case, any final thoughts before we close this out?
I'd just like to clarify what I intend to do as far as next steps and see if that works with council. So No, I wasn't able to take notes on everything. I'm actually delighted that you were so engaged that you made as many comments as you did. So my intent is to review this video, capture as many of the thoughts where I believe that they are likely to bring about a unanimous view. So a lot of these things I think are just plain improvements, and I think those are easy enough to make. On some of them, either because I'm not sure council has unanimity on or even close to it, I might delay those to the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, or on ones that frankly I just don't understand how to best address. So if that works for all of you, I will bring that document back. In the memo, I will highlight the changes that have been made. And if I do my job right, you'll be able to approve it on consent. And I hope to do that next month. The goal would be to have this policy statement finalized and printed and ready for our legislative breakfast on the 13th. And I think we have December 13th. So I think we have ample time to do that. So if that process works for you, that's my intended next steps.
That sounds great, Carl. Anyone else need to give any feedback? Bob Yates, you look like you're just chomping at the bit. I'm kidding. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Carl. And Laurel and everyone else who was involved in that presentation. And with that, let's, Elisha, can you take us to our next agenda item?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Our next item on tonight's agenda is item number 4, matters from the city manager. 4A is the Community Culture, Resilience, and Safety Tax Community Nonprofit Grant Structure item.
Thanks so much, Council. And because you haven't heard enough of Mark Wolf lately with the budget, I'm going to send it over to him and Charlotte Husky in budget as well. They make a great team, and I will turn over the reins.
Thanks, Nuria. Good evening, Council. I'm going to pull up my screen here.
Mark, would you mind introducing yourself?
Absolutely. Can you see my screen all right?
I can, yep.
This is a good thing. Sorry, let me start that again. We'll get it. Feel like I've done this enough that I should be an expert by now. Okay. Good evening, Council. Mark Wolf, Senior Budget Manager. Happy to be with you again. Long time no see. But we're talking about a little bit different subject this evening. We'll be discussing the Community Culture, Resilience, and Safety Tax nonprofit grant program structure. We have discussed this one time before, back in July, so we're going to provide a little bit of framing, and Charlotte will take us through some of our initial history of the tax and the feedback that we've heard through our engagements back in 2021 and earlier in 2022. And then I will summarize council feedback from July and some of the steps that we have taken since to make some revisions to the proposed structure, and again, kind of walk through some examples of how this might look once the criteria is fully developed and we're actually, implementing the program. So the goal this evening is to receive your feedback and essentially, hopefully, get a green light on moving forward to implementation to develop more specific program criteria. So again, we're looking at the broad structure of the program and making sure we're hitting your intent of the creation of that program, and happy to receive that feedback as a part of the discussion later this evening. So Charlotte Husky is our principal budget analyst, and she will take us through these next several slides.
Good evening, Council. I'm Charlotte Husky, a principal budget analyst with the Budget Office. And as Mark mentioned, we're going to go through a brief history of the Community Culture and Safety Tax. The tax was first approved by voters in 2014, which extended, it was a 3-year cycle for the first CCS tax through 2017, generating approximately $27 million over 3 years and funding 13 projects, a mixture of both city and community nonprofit projects. Voters then approved a 4-year cycle through 2021, dubbed CCS2, which generated approximately 42 million over 4 years, with 31 million allocated to city projects and 7.9 for nonprofit support. This past November 2021, voters again extended the CCRS, Community Culture Resilience and Safety Tax, through 2036 for 15 years, the longest extension. The nonprofit program structure was developed with staff and community input, as well as council's input, developed last year between January and June of this year, and we provided a touch point with council in July 22. In addition, we also have appropriation for city projects. Council appropriated 1.7 million so far this year in a special ATB earlier this March, and have planned appropriation of 28.1 million in the 2023 recommended budget. Just a brief reminder of the 21 renewal of the CCRS tax. This renewed the 0.3% dedicated sales and use tax in November of last year, authorizing us to issue debt up to 110 million. Specifically for the ballot language for the nonprofit portion, it stated using up to 10% of tax revenue to fund a grant pool for nonprofit organization projects that serve the people of Boulder. After the renewal was passed in November, we formed an internal steering committee made up of grant managers, internal grant managers within the city, including staff from the Equity Office, the Arts Office, Housing and Human Services, Community Vitality, Communications and Engagement, and Finance, which we formed in January to explore grant structures. We also held several focus group discussions that helped to inform the framework that we put together for council consideration in July, and as well as the revised structure for consideration this evening. The focus group discussions were held last summer as well as earlier this year, where we spoke with nonprofit stakeholders, and they helped identify some challenges and benefits of the potential grant structures. Providing a summary of the 2021 engagement that we held leading up to the tax renewal last November, we held several focus group sessions last summer and received input from 19 nonprofit organizations, including a mixture of large, medium, and small organizations, also including existing CCS grantees. And they provided us some great feedback, including a summarized list here, which includes supporting capital planning grants and planning studies, and not just capital construction projects, making both transformational investments as well as investments in smaller capital projects, supporting projects that have broad reach and support the entire community in Boulder, enhancing flexibility in the grant administration, and ensuring a transparent decision-making process. We also conducted 2 additional sessions this spring in March and April of 22, where we had over 15 representatives from 12 nonprofit organizations, primarily smaller nonprofit organizations participating, and they provided us feedback which helped confirm the program goals and refine potential structures of the grant framework. And this feedback from the stakeholders really fell into 3 general categories or themes. And those themes are grant accessibility and technical assistance, coordination opportunities and flexibility, and value. Under grant accessibility and technical assistance, we heard from many stakeholders that there are significant barriers such as technology, resource capacity, and other resources that prevent them from taking advantage of grant opportunities. They noted that a key factor for success was access to planning opportunities and technical assistance. And they also identified both in the 22 engagement session and the 21 challenges to finding affordable commercial space within Boulder. The second theme of collaboration opportunities, the nonprofit organizations had an interest in the ability to collaborate with other nonprofit organizations and establishing partnerships for a shared nonprofit space to help address gaps in community services. They also noted the partnerships with city staff and want to continue those partnerships with city staff in working on these grants. And the third theme of flexibility and value, we heard that the size of grants should be scaled to the organization side and that there's size and that there should be many different types of grants to support the diversity of nonprofit organizations that exist in the community. So these engagement sessions, as well as our internal steering committee and input that we received from council leading up to the 21 tax extension, helped us develop these funding goals and intended outcomes for the CCRS nonprofit program, listed here, including advancing our racial equity goals and outcomes, addressing critical deficiencies, improving infrastructure, and advancing our vision of being an inclusive and welcoming community, maintaining a healthy, stable, and financially sustainable nonprofit base within Boulder, leveraging investment of public dollars to provide community impact, maximize community impact, and addressing infrastructure needs to ensure community viability while preventing higher costs in the future. And I will hand it over to Mark for the remainder of the presentation.
Thanks, Charlotte. So as I mentioned, we were chatting with you about this proposed program structure back in July. I think it's fair to say that we did have some challenges trying to capture council feedback in certain areas in July. There were a range of opinions on aspects of the program and areas of limited consensus. That being said, there were certainly some areas where we felt we needed to go back to the structure itself and try and capture what we felt were some areas that there may be at least a majority of council that felt that we needed to reevaluate. So some of those areas included clarifying the focus on capital projects, so making sure the intent of the program was in line with voter intent, that we were clarifying the use and limits on technical assistance, that robust evaluation was built into the program structure, that we provided both the capability for larger transformative projects and also access for smaller organizations. And lastly, we heard some range of opinions on the staffing structure of the program itself. So based on that feedback, what we did is, as a staff team, went back to revisit and emphasize the original goals of the program, as Charlotte has outlined, revisit our previous engagement results, again, to make sure that we're in alignment with our nonprofit organizations that will be receiving this assistance, re-emphasizing the importance of the program evaluation, and with that, and I'll touch on this a bit later, in the flexibility associated with evaluating the program, knowing that we were trying something a bit different, and reevaluating the types of grants for clarity. So again, I think because we were looking at a variety of different types, there was some confusion in how we were presenting it. So again, we're trying to clear that up this evening. And then in the specific revisions, we looked at looking at the limitation maximums that we had proposed across the types of grants, and instead look at honing in on the limitations related to the administrative and technical assistance spending. And then lastly, to readjust the timeline and look at the specific process for criteria development and our next council touch point. All right, so I will do a combination of things, and hopefully this won't take too long, but I'll remind council community on the structure of the grants that we had proposed, and we'll walk through some of those changes. So to start, this is the table that we displayed in July. What is important to note here is that we're not proposing to change the different types. So we're proposing to maintain those 3 different types of grants. And I'll remind everybody what the 3 different types of grants were in a moment. I think what's important here is to point out that on the far right, we had proposed these recommended maximums by the type of grant, and we're essentially suggesting to remove that. And I'll speak a little bit more to that. So we'll have 3 different types of grants that I'll walk through the explanation. We'll maintain those 3 different types, but instead of having the limitations by type, what we're proposing is to have these thresholds or maximums across the type of spending, right? So instead of looking at it by type 1, 2, or 3, we'll look at it by the type of spending in capital, planning or technical assistance, and administration. So this ensures that the vast majority of funding is going towards either planning for capital investments or capital investments themselves. And then what we thought would be of use, given that we're trying to reach as many organizations as possible, is let the demand of the program, the demand by type, essentially drive how much spending occurs in each grant type, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but essentially, if there's huge demand in type 1, great, then we'll let our evaluation committee determine that and make those recommendations and awards. If it's in type 2, then great. We want to make sure that the community demand amongst our organization is driving where that spending is, instead of setting arbitrary thresholds at this point in the process. So what does that look like in terms of numbers? So again, 90% would be behind that capital investment. We would reserve up to 10% for those administration costs. Again, this is over the life of the 15-year tax. And then within that 90% of capital investment, we have most of that, 75%, going to that direct capital. And then a portion of that would be reserved for that technical assistance and planning to receive capital dollars. So again, just making sure we're in the capital infrastructure tax. We want to make sure that the vast majority of these dollars are going towards capital projects. All right, so this section will cover what types of grants are we talking about, just as a reminder, and then provide some scenarios of example organizations that may go through the grant process for each type. I want to put a disclaimer here now. These are fake organizations. These do not exist, and at least we were not intending for them to mimic any individual organization. They're just to be instructive of how this grant process may look. So starting with type 1, this is the area where we felt, based on feedback that we had heard in the number of different engagement sessions, that we needed to provide a type of grant that was more accessible to a greater number of organizations. So what type 1 grants are intending to do is invite organizations in where they're at. And so some may be in a position where they're closer to receiving capital dollars. They have a project that is more identified for their facility. Others may be at a stage where they simply need help to get in the door, right? So they might need some technical assistance in organizational development, to do some capital planning, to imagine what their commercial space needs might be, or what their solutions may be. So this is something that we felt important, and in alignment with some of those program goals, was to have a place to go for organizations where they could receive technical assistance in anticipation of a capital investment. So who might be eligible or interested in this type of grant? So we have a couple of different, again, fake organizations. Example a human services organization that is currently renting commercial space. They have a short period of time remaining on their lease, but they've seen an increase in demand for services. They're hiring additional staff, and they're seeking a permanent space solution, knowing that that lease is coming up in a couple of years. So they don't really know where to go from here, but they know they're in need of some assistance, and they're interested in determining that long-term solution. Organization B is or arts and culture organization that currently owns small commercial space. Their property is in need of significant repairs, but they're not sure if those repairs are affordable if they stay in their current space. So these two organizations may be good candidates to pursue type 1 grants, meaning that we would open up applications to organizations. They would define exactly what their need is in a similar summary based on criteria that we would develop over the next few months, and then be connected to services. In the case of organization A, that might be a bit more intensive in terms of the technical assistance to figure out what's the options within their existing space. Is there an option to renew the lease for the long term? Are there other issues on the horizon that they need to be aware of, that they need some assistance in negotiating with their property owner, for instance? Organization B might be a bit closer to a capital investment, where they simply need some capital planning dollars to bring in somebody that can cost out what that project might be. So we've called this a cohort before, but essentially these organizations will be at different places and connected to third-party technical assistance in order to identify exactly what their long-term space solution may be. Some may be going for grant dollars through CCRS, so direct capital assistance for their project within their space. Others may benefit only from the technical assistance in identifying a long-term commercial lease that meets their needs and would not pursue grant dollars beyond that at this point. All right, type 2. So this is the more traditional direct capital investment, more similar to previous CCS grant cycles. We would do this every couple of years. And a couple fake organization scenarios. Organization C, arts performance organization and venue that currently owns their facility. This existing facility is inadequate and needs significant upgrades or even relocating to a new facility. This organization has cash on hand and is interested in a capital campaign, but needs some type of jump start to do so. Organization D is a larger childcare organization that currently owns their facility as well. They have existing event space within their building, but it needs to be expanded. They've determined the exact scope of that project, have determined cost, and are seeking grant dollars specifically for that project. So in both of these instances, we think these would be organizations attractive for type 2 grants. In the case of organization C, they would be seeking to receive city dollars. Criteria could, like other grant cycles in the past, require some type of matching dollars, and there may be some guidance available on timeline and setting up their capital campaign, but this would be more direct capital investment for their space. For organization D, again, they have scoped and costed out their project. They're asking for a specific dollar amount for a specific thing. That would be one of the intents behind the type 2 investments. And lastly, type 3. So this is kind of leaving the door open for other types of community-based facilities where we need some feasibility and partnership with organizations to determine the need, but it's not as straightforward as technical assistance to capital grant or capital dollars directly. So what do we mean by this? Again, this is something that we heard consistently through our focus groups. In these fake organization profiles, one might be a health and education organization that currently rents existing commercial space, and that space happens to be adequate. But they are exploring in looking at common community space to reach teens and youth. They have connected with a couple of organizations to brainstorm ideas, but need guidance on how to scope a project or even look at what the true need is in community. Organization F is a multi-purpose cultural organization that owns commercial space and has previously received grant funds through the city. The organization is interested in simply exploring opportunities to directly engage with teens and youth and other organizations. And so this is a little bit more nebulous, right? There might be some city assistance and support there, but whether it's a direct capital grant is questionable at this stage. So we would invite these types of organizations in to go through a feasibility study if there's areas of commonality. So in this example, if it's a teen and youth center or facility, we would invite organizations in to conduct some type of joint feasibility study to look at existing facilities and services and see if there's a gap. And then there might be the ability to connect to capital investment, depending on the project. That could be CCRS, it could be another source. Again, it just leaves the door open for ideas and innovation without saying it must be type A or B. Kind of say there's a third door here, there's a third option to consider these types of new ideas. All right, recommended next steps. So first, we would need to identify a project manager. That would happen immediately after this meeting, where we would be going through that process. In a parallel track, we would identify third-party technical assistance partners for those planning and technical assistance pieces of the program. We would be working quickly on evaluation design. So we know that creating indicators will be really important so that we can actually measure the impact of our investments, and then set up a process where we have clear checkpoints to return to council to tweak the program as we need. The criteria development and approval would be the next touch point with council. So again, this is the broad framework. There's agreement on the framework, then we would be working with our program manager and grant staff across the city to develop that specific criteria that you all would review and approve before we implemented fully the made available grant dollars. A part of that criteria development and approval would be a review committee that would be charged with making those funding decisions. And I believe I touch on that a little bit in one slide or so. And additional outreach and communication. So again, we had to spend 2 meetings with council to make sure that it was clear what this program might look like. We'll need to do even more of that outreach and communication out in community to make sure that organizations are not only aware of the different types of grants, but we're providing clear explanation of what the opportunity is and which type might be appropriate for which type of need. So timeline, what this looks like, again, this is adjusted slightly. We tried to expedite as best we could here, coming back to you in October. So what we would hope to do is be able to work on the specific criteria through the winter and come back in February for the final approval of that criteria. That would allow us to do outreach to organizations through the early spring, where we'd be targeting a program launch sometime April or May of next year. The review committee would be formed in that May, July window as we launch the program. That would be a combination of city staff and external partners. Again, council will approve the specific criteria, and then we'll have a little bit at arm's length, somebody that, a committee that can help, expertise, using our expertise within the city, but also rely on some community partners to help make those funding decisions. And we're hoping, optimistically, obviously, that depending on the type of grant, we'd be able to get initial grants out next summer. I think that's it. Yep. So questions for council this evening. Generally, do you support the revised structure with the proposed limitations as funding as we outlined? Some feedback on program implementation and evaluation design, and on the process and timeline for council approval of grant criteria, since that will be your next touch point. All right, happy to hand it back over to you, Rachel.
Thanks so much. Thanks to both Mark and Charlotte for those presentations. So let's just take the questions one at a time. So first question is, does council support the revised structure with the funding? Well, let me back it up. Let's see if we have any questions before we answer questions. Questions, I got confused. It's the wrong kind. All right, and my screen's not working. I see Nicole's hand up.
Thank you, Rachel. You caught it. I was just about to ask for questions before we get to questions. I just have two quick questions. One, Mark, and I think, we already went over this a little bit in financial strategies. I just want to make crystal clear that I've got it. For the technical assistance amount, I just wanted to make sure that you all think, based on your feedback, talking to people, that the kind of pocket of funds that's set aside for that is enough to meet the needs. Because this, for me, at least the technical assistance component, is a major equity component of this process. It's really a way that we can ensure that folks who are often left out of grant processes have a path in and have the support they need to figure out how to navigate the system and be successful with these grant opportunities. So I just wanted to make sure that that feels like a good amount to you all.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Appreciate that question. I think so. And it's something we'll evaluate. So we want to make sure that it's in line with voter intent. So that technical assistance provided is to pursue a permanent commercial space solution. And if it's not capital, then it's probably not CCRS as the solution, which is okay. And there's some benefit of that technical assistance. So given that it's not operating support grants, it's not, well, we'll fund no matter what the solution might be. I think it's reasonable, especially for now at this early stage. If the demand is incredible on that level, I think it's something that we'd revisit with council, just like if the demand was great in another type of grant as well. But I think we feel pretty comfortable with that amount for technical assistance for the time being.
Awesome. Thank you. And then my other question was just around the timeline for rollout. Do you have some initial thoughts on plans for outreach? Like if somebody's hearing about this and they, are thinking, wow, I'd be interested in applying for this when it comes out next spring, how do they find out where the applications are going to be, how they get to them, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, good question. So I think we can use some of our normal communication channels that will help. I believe what is unique to where we are today versus where we were in previous CCS processes is that we have access to our wonderful community connectors. And so that is another resource that we would work with our community connectors to get information out. And then we also have incredible networks internally as well. So we issue a number of grants internally. We also work with a number of these organizations as well. So I think through the combination of factors, we can use multiple channels to try to get the word out. I think we also have to develop some materials internally as well and just make sure that it's clear and easy to understand.
Awesome. Thank you. And so I'm assuming there'll be like a website, but just as a landing point, like very basic kind of things that we usually do.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Any other questions before we do the other kind of questions? Okay, so let's answer the staff questions then. So number one, and just raise your hands if you have, if you'd like to pontificate on your answer. And if no one raises their hands, I'd probably just ask for a show of hands. So does council support the revised structure with the funding proportions on administration and planning technical assistance? Would anyone like to speak about this before maybe want to raise a virtual hand? Lauren, thanks.
I just wanted to say that I and appreciate that we did give a really broad variety of feedback. And I think this is a really creative way of solving that issue. And I am really excited that you guys were able to rethink this and bring it back to us in this way. Thank you.
Well said, Nicole.
Yeah, echo just another commendation. I just think it's so clever to get a consortium of partners for the technical assistance, because I imagine the needs can vary a lot. So just wanted to call that out as a specific thing that was really cool.
Awesome. Okay, let's do a show of hands. Who supports this revised structure? I got Rachel, Lauren, Mark, Tara, Nicole, Bob, Junie, Matt. Everyone. Okay, moving on to number 2. Does council support the proposed framework for program implementation and evaluation? Would anyone like to raise a virtual hand to speak to this? Nicole?
Yes, just that I'm hopeful that the metric that we use will include equity in some way. That's kind of giving us an indication of, whether we're getting more grants led by folks who typically haven't applied for grants, or from marginalized groups that haven't often been recipients of grants.
Thanks. All right, no other virtual hands up, so let's do a just show of our real hands. Do you support the proposed framework for implementation and evaluation? You got me, Lauren, Mark, Tara, Nicole, Bob, Junie, Matt, everyone. On to number 3. Does council support the proposed process and timeline for council approval of grant criteria? Virtual hand comments? Nicole, you're letting me down here. I'm counting on you.
Not nothing. I got it all out.
All right. Okay. And let's just do a show of hands. Please raise your hand if you support the proposed process and timeline for council approval. Me, Lauren, Tara, Mark, Nicole, Bob, Junie, Matt, everyone. Well done. Awesome. Any other from council members comments that you'd like to make on this before I check in with staff to see if they have what they need? We got claps and jazz hands. Yeah, that was very well done. And it was sort of herding cats with our feedback. So thank you for taking that slop and bringing us back, a nice casserole or whatever the right metaphor is. So thanks for that. Mark and Charlotte, do you have any questions for us before we tune out?
No, we got what we need. We'll get our next touch point scheduled, but appreciate feedback and glad that we were able to capture wasn't slop, maybe sloppy, but it was good. Thank you.
Casserole. Thanks for it again. All right. With that, Elisha, I believe that's done. The other agenda items are not ones we usually tackle, but do you still read them?
No, that's up to you. That was our last scheduled item.
Thank you, Elisha. Does anyone have discussion items or a debrief? I'm going to adjourn. Good night, everyone. I think we're kind of in the right. We finished almost at the right time. We caught up. Way to double time it.
9:56 p.m.
Nice work, Rachel.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel.
Bye.